There is a moment, somewhere in the grey immensity of the North Atlantic, when a ship stops being a ship. It becomes a sound first. The deep, structural groan of a hull giving way, metal pulling apart from metal, under pressures it was never designed to survive. Then it becomes light, briefly, against all that darkness. Then it becomes silence, and then it becomes a position on a chart, a tonnage figure in a log, and eventually, a name on a list that nobody reads anymore. The Battle of the Atlantic killed more than 30,000 German submariners. It killed more than 36,000 Allied merchant sailors. It killed naval officers. It killed airmen. It killed men who had never wanted to fight anyone and simply found themselves crossing an ocean at the wrong point in history. It was fought across millions of square kilometers of water, with no front lines and no witnesses, in conditions of cold and darkness and isolation that defy comfortable imagination. It was one of the longest, costliest, and most strategically decisive campaigns of the entire Second World War, and for years it was fought almost entirely beneath the surface of public consciousness, hidden by the same deep water that swallowed its dead. Tonight, we are going to the bottom of all of that. Not just the tactics and the tonnage figures, not just the turning points and the command decisions, though we will cover all of it, in full. We are going to find the human story underneath, specifically, one man's story, which happens to cut directly across every contradiction and moral complexity that the Battle of the Atlantic contains. His name was Herbert Schultze. He was a U-boat commander, one of the most effective in the entire war. By the time he stepped away from active sea command, he had sent more Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic than almost anyone in the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm. He was decorated by the regime that started the war. He was celebrated in propaganda newsreels. He was, by every conventional military measure, enormously successful at doing something that caused enormous suffering. He was also the man who stopped his submarine after sinking a British vessel, surfaced in the middle of a contested Atlantic, and transmitted a radio message to the British Admiralty in clear, unencrypted language, giving them the exact position of the survivors floating in the water he had just put them in, and asking them to please send rescue ships. He did it more than once. The British Admiralty received those messages. British naval officers read them. British newspapers eventually wrote about them. And somewhere in the machinery of a total war that was grinding human beings into history on an industrial scale, that act, that choice, made by one man on the surface of the ocean, created something that could not quite be destroyed by everything that came after it. A reputation, a kind of memory, a nickname that followed Herbert Schultze for the rest of his long life, the Gentleman of the Atlantic. Now, before we go any further, we want to say something directly to you, because this documentary is going to ask something of you that not all war history does. It is going to ask you to hold two things in your mind at the same time. The first is that Herbert Schultze was a genuinely remarkable human being, operating under conditions of almost unimaginable stress, who made choices that cost him nothing, strategically, and potentially everything personally, choices that reflected a moral compass, stubbornly intact, inside one of the most dehumanizing conflicts in recorded history. The second is that Herbert Schultze was a senior officer in the Kriegsmarine, the naval arm of Nazi Germany, and that the submarines he commanded were instruments of a blockade strategy designed to starve Britain into surrender. The men he rescued from one sinking were replaced, in the terrible arithmetic of war, by other men he subsequently put into the same cold water. Small acts of decency and large-scale destruction are not opposites that cancel each other out. They are the simultaneous truth of what one man's life in that war actually looked like. We will not simplify this for you. This documentary is not a redemption story, and it is not a prosecution. It is a history, and the history of Herbert Schultze is, we believe, one of the most genuinely interesting individual stories the Battle of the Atlantic has produced, precisely because it refuses to resolve into something comfortable. We are going to start at the beginning, in the port city of Kiel, where a boy grew up watching warships move through grey water at the turn of a century that had no idea what was coming for it. We will follow Schultze through his training in a navy, operating under the humiliating restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding itself in secret, dreaming itself back into existence under the direction of a calculating and visionary admiral named Karl Dönitz. We will follow him into the grey steel interior of U-48, one of the most successful submarines of the entire war, and we will ride with him through the early patrols of 1939 and 1940, when the U-boats had the Atlantic almost to themselves, and the tonnage figures climbed week by week in a way that terrified the British Admiralty. We will cover the happy time. We will cover the medals and the propaganda and the quiet unease of a professional sailor being asked to wear a political costume that didn't quite fit. We will cover the moment the tide turned, slowly at first, then catastrophically, through Black May of 1943 and beyond, when the wolf packs started losing boats faster than Germany could build them, and an entire generation of young submariners began disappearing into the Atlantic at a rate that made the earlier successes look obscene in retrospect. We will reckon, properly, with the human cost on both sides. The merchant sailors matter here. The Allied naval crews matter here. The young Germans who went out on their final patrols matter here. This documentary will not let the tonnage figures stand in for the people they represent. And then we will follow Schultze out of the war, through defeat and surrender, and the long, disorienting process of becoming a civilian in a destroyed country. And we will ask what a man does with a history like his, how he carries it, what he says about it, and what he doesn't, and what it means that the people who remembered him most warmly were sometimes the people on the other side. This is a long documentary. It was designed to be. If you are settling in for the night, if the room is quiet and the light is low, and you are ready to let the Atlantic come to you through your headphones, then this is exactly what we made it for. The story is long because the war was long, and because the life was long, and because anything worth understanding usually takes more than a few minutes to understand properly. So, settle in. The water is cold tonight, and it has a great deal to tell us. If this is the kind of history you want more of, deep, slow, built to last the whole night, then consider subscribing before we go any further. There is more where this came from, much more. But for now, let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to Kiel, back to the water, back to the boy who would one day transmit a radio message that a British admiral read twice before he believed it, and then read a third time, quietly, to himself. The sea is waiting. There is a city on the Baltic coast of northern Germany where the land does not so much meet the sea as surrender to it. Kiel sits at the innermost point of a long, sheltered fjord, a natural harbour so deep and so calm that warships could anchor within sight of church spires and market squares. For centuries it had been a trading port, a fishing town, a place where men learned early that their fortunes were tied to the water. But by the final decades of the 19th century, Kiel had become something more deliberate, more purposeful, and considerably more dangerous. The German Imperial Navy had chosen it as its principal base, and the city had transformed accordingly. Dry docks and shipyards consuming the waterfront, the hulks of battleships rising above the rooftops like grey cathedrals, the smell of coal smoke and machine oil drifting through streets where sailors walked in uniform and civilians measured the seasons not by harvest, but by fleet exercises in the fjord. It was into this world, shaped entirely by the logic of naval power, that Herbert Schultze was born. The year was 1915, the war that would eventually unmake the empire, whose navy filled his harbour, was already 1 year old. To grow up in Kiel in those years was to grow up inside a contradiction. The city was at once a place of immense martial energy and, increasingly, a place of grief. The Imperial Navy that dominated the waterfront was fighting a war it had been built for, but could not quite win. The Great Surface Fleet, constructed at enormous national expense to challenge British sea power, spent much of the war anchored at Wilhelmshaven, under orders that kept it from risking a decisive engagement. The Battle of Jutland in 1916, fought in the waters not impossibly far from where young Schultze would have taken his first steps, ended without the crushing German victory that would have justified the fleet's existence. The city felt the tension between pride and futility in ways that even a child absorbs without fully understanding. The uniforms were still pressed, the bands still played, but the men who came back from the sea came back changed, and the men who did not come back left gaps in the terraced streets that no amount of official commemoration could fill. Schultze's family background placed him squarely within the military and administrative middle class that formed the backbone of Imperial Germany and would later struggle hardest to make sense of its collapse. His father's world was one of order and obligation, of professional duty taken seriously as both a moral and a civic virtue. It was the kind of household where maps were a normal sight on walls, where the names of naval battles were known the way other families knew the names of saints, and where service to something larger than oneself was presented not as a sacrifice, but as a self-evident purpose. Schultze would carry those assumptions with him all his life, though the institutions he served would change beyond anything his parents' generation could have anticipated. What did not change was the basic orientation, the sense that a man defined himself by how he performed his duty, and that character was measured under pressure rather than in comfort. The harbour itself was the real educator of his childhood. Kiel's waterfront in the early 1920s retained enough of its imperial ambition to impress a young boy, even as the fleet that once filled it had been reduced to a skeleton by the terms of armistice and treaty. The ships that remained were smaller, older, or foreign. Some of the most powerful German vessels had been surrendered, towed away, or scuttled by their own crews. At Scapa Flow in 1919, in an act of defiance that Germans of every political inclination chose to remember as a point of honor. But even diminished, the harbour was extraordinary. The sounds alone were an education. The low groan of steel under pressure, the sharp reports of riveting hammers from the yards, the particular quality of silence that falls over a large vessel at anchor. A boy who spent his formative years absorbing those sounds could not easily become anything other than a man drawn to the sea. The Germany that shaped Schultze's adolescence was a country in profound and sometimes violent flux. The Weimar Republic, born from defeat and revolution, governed a nation that had lost not just a war, but an entire conception of itself. Inflation in the early 1920s reduced savings to dust, wiped out the careful financial security of families like Schultze's, and produced a bitterness that remained even after the economy stabilized. Veterans of the war sold medals on street corners. Politicians argued constantly about who was responsible for the defeat, a question that would eventually be answered by demagogues, with answers far more satisfying and far more dangerous than the truth. Schultze was a child during the worst of it, a teenager during the relative stability of the late 1920s, and a young man just entering the military as the Great Depression struck and the political situation began its final, accelerating deterioration. His generation was formed entirely in the space between one catastrophe and the approach of another. What the sea offered, against that background of instability and wounded national pride, was a kind of permanence. The fjord did not care about the Republic or the inflation or the arguments in the newspapers. The tides moved on their own calendar. The ships that came and went obeyed physics and wind, and the decisions of navigators rather than the votes of parliaments. For a young man raised to believe in duty and order and professional excellence, the Navy represented something that still functioned, still had clear hierarchies and clear standards, still offered the possibility of measuring oneself against something real and demanding. The military services, and the Navy in particular, became one of the few institutions of the old Germany that could still recruit young men from respectable families without apology or explanation. Schultze would have understood this instinctively long before he was old enough to articulate it. He was not yet a teenager when the Imperial Navy he had grown up watching completed its final, undignified exit from German life. The great battleships, interned at Scapa Flow, surrendered under the armistice terms, had been scuttled by German crews in the summer of 1919. 74 warships sent to the bottom by their own men rather than surrendered intact. The story reached every German household that cared about such things, and in Kiel, every household cared about such things. It was presented, and genuinely felt, as a final act of defiance, a refusal to hand over what had been built with such effort and such sacrifice. The truth was considerably more complicated. The scuttling was also an act of desperation by men, uncertain of their futures, and unwilling to accept their humiliation passively. But the myth that formed around it was clean and usable. Germany had not surrendered its navy. Germany had destroyed it first. It was precisely the kind of story a generation needed, and precisely the kind of story that made the rebuilding of German sea power feel less like aggression and more like restoration. By the time Schultze was moving through his school years and beginning to think seriously about his future, the naval presence in Kiel had changed in character without disappearing entirely. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed savage restrictions on what Germany was permitted to maintain by way of a military fleet, a small number of surface vessels, strict limits on tonnage, and a complete prohibition on submarines, the weapons that had come closest to severing Britain's Atlantic supply lines during the war. The Reichsmarine, as the diminished German naval service was now known, operated within these constraints, but also, quietly and methodically, worked around them. Submarine development continued in secret, funded through shell companies, and conducted partly abroad. The men who would eventually command Germany's rebuilt U-boat arm were already being identified, trained, and assigned to shadow programs whose existence was not officially acknowledged. Kiel felt the pull of all of this, even if most of it was invisible to civilian eyes. The influence of place on character is always difficult to measure precisely, but in Schultze's case, the relationship between Kiel and the man he became seems unusually direct. Cities that live by and for the sea produce people with particular qualities: patience, attentiveness to conditions that change without warning, a respect for forces larger than individual will, and a practical intelligence that prizes competence over theory. The harbour taught all of this without a classroom. A boy who watched enough ship movements, listened to enough sailors, absorbed enough of the rhythms of a working port, came away with an intuitive grasp of seamanship that formal training would later build upon, rather than install from scratch. Schultze's childhood in Kiel did not guarantee the naval career that followed, but it made that career feel like the only logical conclusion of everything he had absorbed before he was old enough to choose. There was also something else, less tangible, but no less real. Kiel, in the years of Schultze's childhood, was a community still processing grief. The grief of a lost war, of men who had not returned, of a national purpose that had collapsed before it could be fulfilled. The response to that grief varied. Some men turned toward political extremism, searching for simple explanations and simpler enemies. Some withdrew into private life and tried to wait out whatever came next. Some, and this seems to have been Schultze's disposition, turned the grief into resolve, a determination to be so thoroughly excellent at whatever they chose to do that the external chaos became irrelevant. The Navy offered a context for exactly that kind of resolve. It had standards that did not bend to politics, skills that did not care about ideology, and a tradition, however battered, that a young man from Kiel could attach himself to with something approaching pride. He was a serious boy in a serious city, in a country that had learned, at enormous cost, what happened when seriousness gave way to desperation. The parades and the ceremonies and the official commemorations that marked the naval calendar in Kiel were not lost on him. He watched the men in uniform with the focused attention of someone who has already decided, on some level below the reach of words, that this is the life he wants. The sea was where he was pointed from the beginning, pointed by geography, by family, by the particular quality of the air in a port city where everything of consequence arrived or departed by water. He could not yet know what that life would ask of him. He could not know the depths, literal and moral, to which it would eventually take him. He knew only what every boy raised beside a great harbor eventually knows, that the water offers both the possibility of departure and the certainty of return, and that there is no more complete education in the nature of risk than learning to read the face of the sea. The year Herbert Schultze raised his hand and swore his oath to the Reichsmarine, Germany's navy was a ghost haunting its own harbor. The great fleet that had once made the British Admiralty sleepless, that had sortied into the North Sea and fought the colossal, inconclusive engagement off Jutland, had sailed itself to Scapa Flow at the end of the Great War and been scuttled by its own crews rather than handed over intact to the victors. What remained after the Treaty of Versailles was an institution stripped to its skeleton. 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 6 light cruisers, a handful of destroyers and torpedo boats, no submarines whatsoever. The men who still wore the uniform of a German naval officer did so inside an organization reduced by treaty to fewer than 15,000 souls. For a young man drawn to the sea with the ambition to command, it was, on paper, a discouraging inheritance. And yet, there was something particular about joining a service that had been humiliated but not destroyed. A kind of fierce, compressed energy lived inside those restricted ranks. The officers who survived the transition from the Imperial Navy to the Reichsmarine carried with them professional standards, honed across decades, and they had no intention of letting those standards dissolve in peacetime obscurity. When Schultze entered the naval training pipeline in the early 1930s, he stepped into a world of exceptional rigor. The Reichsmarine could not project power across the oceans, but it could do the one thing still available to it. It could make its officers superb. Every man trained harder and more carefully than a navy of that size technically needed to train, because every officer understood that the restrictions were not permanent, and that when they lifted, only the prepared would matter. Officer training in the Reichsmarine of that era was a long and uncompromising education. Cadets were put through sea time aboard sailing vessels before they ever touched a modern warship, an old philosophy rooted in the conviction that a man who could not read the wind and the water at their most elemental could not truly be trusted with machinery. Navigation was drilled to a standard of precision that bordered on the obsessive. Seamanship, gunnery theory, signals, and ship handling consumed the working hours, and the evaluations were merciless. The culture was one of quiet, unemotional excellence, not the theatrical swagger that propaganda would later attach to the warrior heroes of the Third Reich, but something colder and more durable than swagger. Schultze absorbed that culture. The boy from Kiel, who had grown up watching the grey shapes of warships move against the horizon, now began to learn, in granular detail, what it actually meant to drive one. His early mentors were men of the old school, officers who had served in the Imperial Navy and brought with them a code of professional conduct formed in an earlier age. The traditions they transmitted were not sentimental. They centered on the idea that an officer's authority derived entirely from competence, judgment, and the trust of his crew. An officer who did not know his ship could not lead his crew. An officer who did not understand his enemy could not protect his men. An officer who let his composure break under pressure became a danger to everyone around him. These were not merely tactical instructions. They were moral propositions, dressed in professional language, and they left their marks. The idea that command carried not just power, but obligation, that the man at the top of a hierarchy bore the heaviest personal responsibility for the men beneath him, ran through the training culture like an iron seam. That idea would later surface in Schultze's conduct on the open Atlantic in ways that neither he nor his mentors could have anticipated. While Schultze trained, the world around Germany was reshaping itself in ways that would determine the arc of his entire career. The economic catastrophe of the late 1920s and early 1930s was doing to German society what the treaty alone had not managed. It was radicalizing it. The Weimar Republic staggered under the weight of reparations, inflation, and mass unemployment, and the political forces that stood to benefit from that staggering were not democratic ones. By the time Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January of 1933, the Reichsmarine's officer corps had been watching the country's political fracture with a mixture of professional detachment and private unease. The Navy, historically, considered itself a cut above the messier currents of domestic politics. It prized institutional continuity. What it could not yet know was how completely that institutional continuity was about to be weaponized. The transformation of the Reichsmarine into the Kriegsmarine in 1935 was not simply a rebranding exercise. It was a public declaration that Germany no longer considered itself bound by the restrictions of Versailles. A declaration made with the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which granted Germany the right to rebuild its fleet to 35% of British naval tonnage, and crucially, full parity in submarines. For the officers who had spent the past decade and a half in a deliberately stunted service, it was a moment of profound professional release. The restraints were coming off. The question was, what kind of navy would emerge from underneath them, and who would shape its doctrine? That question had an answer already forming in the mind of one particular officer. Karl Dönitz had served in submarines during the Great War, had been captured and spent time as a prisoner, and had returned to the post-war Reichsmarine, carrying convictions about submarine warfare that most of his superiors considered premature at best and irrelevant at worst. Dönitz believed that the submarine was not a secondary weapon, but potentially the decisive one, that a nation capable of cutting Britain's Atlantic supply lines could strangle the British war economy without ever engaging the surface fleet in the kind of set-piece battle that naval traditionalists continued to romanticize. His ideas about coordinated submarine attacks on convoys, what would eventually be formalized as wolf pack tactics, were worked out in exercises and war games during the 1930s, tested and refined with the quiet, systematic patience of a man who believed absolutely in what he was building. Schultze's path and Dönitz's doctrine would eventually converge, but in the early years of the Kriegsmarine's existence, Schultze was still moving through the broader naval training system, accumulating experience and rank. The expanding service was hungry for capable officers, and the pace of that expansion created both opportunity and pressure. New vessels were being commissioned, new specializations were opening. The submarine arm, once legally forbidden, was being rebuilt from scratch, not loudly or with any great public ceremony, but with the methodical German naval professionalism that had always preferred competence over theater. Men were being evaluated, selected, and streamed. Those with the right combination of technical aptitude, psychological steadiness, and command instinct were quietly directed toward the boats. The clandestine nature of Germany's submarine revival before 1935 deserves a moment's consideration. The complete prohibition on U-boats under Versailles had not, in fact, stopped German submarine development entirely. German engineers and naval planners had worked through foreign subsidiaries and technical exchange arrangements to keep submarine design knowledge alive across the interwar years. When the Anglo-German naval agreement finally opened the door, the Kriegsmarine was not starting from zero. The designs were ready. The industrial capability was prepared. What the expanding submarine arm now needed, above everything else, were the men who would take those boats to sea, officers capable of independent command in one of the most demanding and isolated environments any sailor could face, with nothing above them but water, and nothing below them but the dark. For a young officer of Schultze's generation, the choice to move towards submarines was not a comfortable one. The boats were small, mechanically complex, physically punishing, and, as any honest reading of the Great War's submarine losses would confirm, extraordinarily dangerous. There was nothing glamorous about life inside a steel tube that condensed moisture on its walls, smelled of oil and unwashed men, and could be sent to the bottom by a single well-placed depth charge. And yet the submarine arm offered something that no other branch of the expanding Kriegsmarine could quite match. It offered genuine command. The captain of a U-boat was not a cog in a fleet formation. He was an independent operator, responsible for his boat, his crew, and his tactical decisions, in a way that surface officers of comparable rank rarely were. For a man shaped by the command philosophy of his training years, the philosophy that authority derived from competence and carried absolute personal responsibility, that kind of independence was not a drawback. It was the whole point. By the time Schultze completed the training that would lead him to his first submarine posting, the Kriegsmarine was already moving on a trajectory that its own senior officers could only partially control. The political machinery of the Third Reich was accelerating events. Rearmament was intensifying. Dönitz was pressing for more boats, more resources, more urgency in preparing the submarine arm for a war he considered inevitable and imminent. The navy that Herbert Schultze had joined as a restricted, humbled institution of barely 15,000 men was becoming something altogether different. A service expanding rapidly, carrying the weight of national ambition and ideological pressure, pointed toward a conflict that would consume millions of lives across the grey waters of the North Atlantic. Schultze had chosen this service, shaped himself to its standards, and earned his place within it. What the sea would ask of him next was something that no training program, however rigorous, could fully prepare a man to answer. The submarine was not a weapon for men who needed comfort. It was a steel cylinder, rarely wider than a city tram, sealed against the ocean by nothing more than engineering and human nerve. The men who climbed down into it left behind daylight, open air, and the simple reassurance of horizon. What they found below was a world of compressed smells, diesel fuel, bilge water, unwashed bodies, the metallic bite of pressurized air, layered so thick that newcomers often gagged before they had even reached their stations. The boat moved through the water with a kind of blind animal persistence, trusting in instruments and mathematics and the steady hands of men trained to think in 3 dimensions. For Herbert Schultze, stepping into this world was not a moment of dread, but of recognition. He had been drawn toward the sea his whole life. Now the sea had drawn him beneath itself. The Germany he served in the middle years of the 1930s was a country remaking its own image with furious speed. The military constraints imposed at the end of the previous war were being shed one by one, and nowhere was that shedding more dramatic than in the Navy. Submarines had been banned entirely by the treaty that had humiliated Germany after 1918, and yet by the mid-1930s, they were being built again, commissioned and crewed, and slipped quietly into the Baltic for trials. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 gave formal permission for what had already been informally underway. The U-boat arm existed again, officially and openly, and it needed officers. Schultze came to submarine training carrying the technical foundation of his Kriegsmarine preparation, but the specifics of undersea warfare required a whole new education. He took to it the way certain men take to difficult things, not easily, but with the kind of absorption that suggests the difficulty itself is the attraction. Submarine training in the German Navy of that era was serious work, shaped by hard-won institutional memory. The men who designed the program remembered the First War, remembered what the U-boats had very nearly accomplished in the waters around Britain between 1915 and 1918. They also remembered the errors, tactical, strategic, and political, that had ultimately squandered that near victory. The new training curriculum was built to correct those errors and to harden men against the psychological weight of extended submersion. Trainees learned trim and ballast, torpedo firing solutions, hydrophone operation, navigation by dead reckoning in the absence of any visual reference. They learned how to keep a boat alive when depth charges were falling, and they learned how to remain calm in the dark. The assumption embedded in every lesson was that their knowledge would one day be tested, not in an exercise, but for real, in cold water, with people trying to kill them. Above all of this, directing and reshaping the doctrine of the entire submarine arm, stood Karl Dönitz. He had commanded a U-boat in the previous war, had been captured, had spent time in British captivity, turning over in his mind what had worked and what had not. By the time he was given command of the new U-boat force, he had developed a strategic philosophy that was as simple in its articulation as it was ruthless in its logic. The goal was tonnage, not the sinking of warships, not tactical glory, not individual duels between hunter and hunted. Tonnage. Britain was an island nation dependent on imported goods for its survival, and if enough of those goods could be sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, Britain would be strangled from the outside in. Dönitz calculated with the coldness of an accountant the minimum rate of sinking required to outpace British construction and repair, and he built everything around achieving that number. His commanders were not knights-errant, they were instruments of economic destruction at sea. This doctrine, which became known as the Tonnage War, shaped the way Schultze and every other U-boat commander of his generation understood their mission. The enemy was not primarily the men on the ships they targeted. The enemy was the cargo, the steel, the grain, the oil, the ammunition, the sheer accumulated weight of supply that kept Britain functioning. It was an abstraction that allowed men to do violent things with a degree of professional detachment, and it was also a framework that Dönitz drilled into his commanders relentlessly. Schultze absorbed it as doctrine, what he would do with it in practice, how he would interpret it when human faces appeared above the waterline rather than tonnage figures in a logbook, would eventually set him apart from nearly all his peers. But that reckoning was still ahead of him, for now he was learning the machine and learning his place inside it. Life aboard a Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, was an exercise in sustained endurance. The Type 7 displaced fewer than 1,000 tons and carried a crew of around 50 men into patrols that could last weeks or even months. There was no spare space anywhere. Torpedoes were stored in the forward compartment, and men slept alongside them and above them, their bunks arranged around the weapons in configurations that left almost no room to turn over. The single toilet served the entire crew and was itself so technically complicated that sailors had to be formally instructed in its use to prevent dangerous pressure reversals. Food was loaded in such quantities at the start of a patrol that it was stacked in every available corner, and as supplies were consumed, the living space very slowly improved, until it was replaced by the accumulated grime and exhaustion of men who had been confined together for too long. The psychological architecture of a U-boat crew was as important as its technical training. 50 men in a small steel tube, submerged for hours at a time, hunting in waters where a single error could kill them all. The cohesion of that crew depended entirely on the character of the man in command. Dönitz understood this, which is why he invested so heavily in the selection and mentoring of his commanders. The commander did not merely give orders, he set the temperature of the boat. If he was anxious, the crew felt it. If he was steady, the crew steadied itself. If he punished failure with contempt, the crew grew careful and cautious in the wrong ways. If he held his men to high standards while also holding them with a degree of genuine regard, he got the best they had to give. Schultze was forming his understanding of all of this across his early postings, watching how experienced commanders handled the pressure, noting what worked and what corroded the bond between officers and ratings. His early submarine assignments were the years of formation rather than record. He was finding the rhythms of the work, the long stretches of surface running in search of targets, the dive and the wait, the decision-making under conditions of extreme stress and limited information. He was learning how the boat sounded when it was healthy and how it sounded when something was wrong. He was learning how to read the sea from the perspective of a man inside it rather than above it, how weather affected the hunt and the escape, how the interaction between tides and thermoclines could hide a submarine from enemy hydrophones or deliver it into catastrophic exposure. He was developing what experienced submariners called feel, an intuitive sense of the boat and its situation that complemented and sometimes surpassed the instruments. It could not be taught directly. It was accumulated through immersion, through repetition, through the willingness to keep going when every instinct cried out for the surface. Something else was forming in these years, something harder to classify than tactical competence. Schultze was building an internal standard, a private code about how he wished to conduct himself as a commander. The Kriegsmarine had its official standards, and Dönitz had his doctrine, but neither of those things fully answered the questions that pressed on a thoughtful officer. Questions about the men he commanded, about the men on the ships he was ordered to destroy, about the line between professional duty and something that could no longer be called professional once it crossed into the nakedly inhumane. Schultze was not a pacifist, and he was not naive. He understood that the work he was training for would involve death, the deaths of others, and potentially his own. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it without remainder are different things. and the residue of doubt, of conscience, of basic human feeling toward other human beings did not leave him. He carried it into command. It would eventually define him. By the second half of the 1930s, the U-boat arm was expanding rapidly, and the atmosphere within it was charged with the particular energy of an organization that believes itself on the cusp of proving something. The older hands from the previous war lent the enterprise a sense of continuity and unfinished history. The younger officers, like Schultze, brought fresh energy and technical facility. Dönitz held it all together with an unusual combination of intellectual rigor and personal intensity. He knew his commanders by name, knew their strengths and their edges, and worked to place the right men in the right boats with a care that his counterparts in other services rarely matched. Within this world, Schultze was seen as a man of quality, composed, technically capable, possessed of the kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself through volume or display. What the expanding U-boat arm was preparing for was not yet fully articulated in the mid to late 1930s, at least not officially. There were exercises and war games. There were theoretical tonnage calculations and convoy interception drills. But the official political posture still maintained that war was not coming. No one in the submarine arm truly believed this. The boats were being built, the commanders were being trained, the doctrine was being refined. None of that pointed toward peace. Schultze and the officers around him lived with the widening gap between official reassurance and evident preparation, and most of them resolved the tension by focusing on the immediate task: the boat, the crew, the next exercise, the next dive. If war came, they would be ready. They spent their energy making that true and left the larger questions to those with the authority and the appetite to answer them. When war did come, in the early autumn of 1939, the U-boat arm was neither as ready as it had hoped, nor as unprepared as it feared. The boats were there, the commanders were there, the doctrine was in place. What was missing was numbers. There were far fewer submarines operational than Dönitz had calculated he would need to prosecute the tonnage war effectively. But those that were ready went immediately to sea, and Schultze among them. All of the formation, the training, the early postings, the years of accumulated skill and quietly evolving conscience was about to meet its accounting. The Atlantic was waiting, cold and vast, and indifferent to the plans of nations or the private codes of individual men. The 1st of September, 1939, Poland was already burning when the signal reached the U-boat pens. Herbert Schultze was 30 years old, a trained submarine officer, standing at the threshold of a war his country had just ignited, and he was about to take a vessel to sea with orders whose moral edges had not yet been fully defined. The boat was U-48, a Type 7C in the making of the German submarine fleet's most numerous and celebrated class, a craft roughly 67 meters in length, displacing just over 750 tons when surfaced, and built for exactly the kind of ocean war that Karl Dönitz had been quietly designing for years. She was not yet legendary. She was simply a boat, smelling of diesel and iron, and the particular dampness that never fully leaves a submarine's hull. Schultze walked her decks with the measured confidence of a man who had spent years preparing for this moment. Yet even seasoned preparation cannot fully anticipate the weight of the first time the ocean becomes a battlefield. Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, 1939, 2 days after the invasion of Poland. For the men of the U-boat arm, that declaration was both confirmation and complication. They had a mission: to strangle Britain's Atlantic supply lines, to sink the tonnage that kept an island nation alive. But the legal and strategic framework governing how that mission could be carried out was, in the earliest weeks of the war, deeply and deliberately ambiguous. The prize regulations, a body of international maritime law governing the treatment of enemy merchant vessels, required that a warship identify itself before attacking, warn the crew, allow time for evacuation, and in some circumstances, even provide for the safety of survivors before the vessel was sunk. These were rules inherited from an older, arguably more honorable tradition of naval warfare. In a war fought with submarines, in waters patrolled by enemy aircraft and warships, they were also rules that could get a U-boat and its entire crew killed. Dönitz understood this tension precisely. He had been pressing the Naval High Command for authority to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare, the right to attack without warning any vessel in declared war zones, since before the conflict formally began. What he received instead was a graduated, sometimes contradictory set of directives that would shift and tighten over the coming months. In the early weeks, his commanders were ordered to operate within the prize rules against most targets, with exceptions carved out for armed merchant vessels and ships sailing in convoy. For Schultze, this meant that his first encounters with enemy shipping would require him to operate on the surface, in clear view, issuing warnings and observing procedures that exposed his crew and his vessel to significant risk. He did so, and in doing so, he began to reveal something about himself that the prize rules alone cannot explain. U-48's early patrols took her into the North Atlantic, along the approaches that funneled traffic toward British ports. The shipping lanes were busy, in ways that feel almost impossible to imagine from the quiet of the present. Merchant vessels moving singly, in pairs, in loosely organized convoys, carrying grain, steel, fuel, and the 10,000 categories of material that kept the British war economy and its civilian population functioning. For the men aboard those ships, the first weeks of the war were a period of frightening recalibration. The loss of merchant vessels to U-boat attack had begun almost immediately after the declaration of war, a brutal signal that the Atlantic would not be a safe corridor. They sailed, with that knowledge pressing against them, every watch, in every sea state, under every sky. Schultze's first confirmed sinkings came in those opening weeks of the conflict, and they came with a characteristic quality that would mark his entire combat career. He followed procedure. Where the prize rules applied, he applied them. Where his orders permitted attack without warning, he attacked. He was not sentimental about the strategic purpose of his mission, to deprive Britain of the supplies she needed to sustain the war. But he was, by multiple accounts that would accumulate over time, unusually attentive to the question of what happened to the people aboard the ships he sank. This was not, in the U-boat arm of 1939, a universal instinct. The logic of submarine warfare worked against it. Surfacing near survivors, attracted danger, delayed the boat, and broadcast position to any listening station. The practical case for leaving the sea to sort out its own aftermath was straightforward. Schultze did not entirely accept it. The tonnage began to accumulate. Each confirmed sinking required the filing of a Kriegstagebuch, a war diary, documenting the engagement, the position, the name and tonnage of the vessel if known, and the actions taken. These documents, dry in language by official necessity, nevertheless contain within them the compressed reality of lives overturned. A ship named in a war diary entry was a community of men who had their own routines, their own watches, their own reasons for being at sea. Many of them were not military men in any formal sense. They were merchant sailors, men whose profession had always carried risk, but who now found themselves operating in what amounted to a combat zone, with no armor and very limited protection. U-48's record, growing in these early months, was built on those encounters. It was during this period, before the autumn of 1939 had fully turned, that Schultze made a decision that no order required and no regulation demanded. After sinking a British merchant vessel, he transmitted a radio message to the British Admiralty, giving the position of the survivors and requesting that a rescue vessel be dispatched. The precise wording of that first message and the exact patrol on which it was sent belongs to the documented record, but the act itself is the important thing, and it was entirely voluntary. He did not have to do it. He was under no obligation to do it. Broadcasting on a known frequency, while surfaced in waters where enemy warships and aircraft might be listening, was not a conservative tactical choice. It was a choice made, apparently, because the men in the water had ceased in his mind to be abstractions of tonnage and enemy capacity, and had remained stubbornly human. The reaction on the British side was, to put it plainly, bewilderment. The Royal Navy and the officers of the Admiralty had been prepared for submarine warfare of the most ruthless variety. The experience of the First World War had made that preparation a near obsession. What they had not anticipated was a signal from the commander of an enemy vessel asking them to save the men he had just put in the water. The message was verified. The position was real. Rescue vessels were dispatched. The men were recovered. And somewhere in the chain of communication between the Atlantic and Whitehall, a file began to accumulate. The file of a German U-boat commander who appeared to be conducting his war by a set of rules that no treaty had written down. Back at the U-boat headquarters, the response was rather more complicated. Dönitz's central concern was operational effectiveness. The relentless mathematics of tons sunk against British capacity to absorb loss and resupply. A commander who broke radio silence to alert the enemy to his own position was, by any strict reading of submarine doctrine, taking an unacceptable risk. Dönitz was not a man who tolerated freelancing where it compromised security. That Schultze was not formally reprimanded, at least not in any way the surviving record makes clear, suggests either that the acts were viewed as tolerable given his results, or that the moral weight of the situation was not entirely lost, even on the pragmatists of the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, or perhaps both. Schultze was producing results. He was sinking tonnage at a rate that kept him among the arm's leading performers. It is hard to discipline a commander who is simultaneously one of your most effective weapons. Through the closing months of 1939, the dual nature of Schultze's war became more clearly drawn. On one level, he was precisely what the Kriegsmarine needed him to be, a capable, decisive, aggressive U-boat commander who took U-48 into dangerous waters and came back with a steadily growing tally. On another level, something was operating in him that sat outside the purely military logic of the campaign. His crew noticed it. The particular way he ran the boat, the attention he paid to his men's condition, the way he handled the rare and terrible moments when a sinking produced survivors he could see in the water. These things accrued in the memory of the men who served under him. Discipline aboard U-48 was not soft. The submarine was too dangerous an environment for soft discipline, but it was discipline exercised by a commander who appeared to regard his crew as men rather than instruments, and who appeared to regard his enemies, once they were no longer combatants, in very much the same way. The prize regulations were effectively suspended for most practical purposes as the war widened and the strategic pressure intensified. The shift toward unrestricted submarine warfare was neither immediate nor clean. It came in phases, through the progressive expansion of declared war zones and the loosening of engagement rules. By the time that shift was substantially complete, Schultze had already established, in those early months of constrained warfare, the pattern of conduct that would define his reputation. The acts that would later generate headlines and astonishment across Europe were not spontaneous anomalies in an otherwise unremarkable career. They grew from a disposition that had already been visible in those first, tentative, legally complex engagements of the autumn of 1939. The Atlantic was cold and enormous, and largely indifferent to the moral calculations of the men fighting across it. But the calculations were being made nonetheless, quietly, in the conning tower of a German submarine, by a commander who had not yet finished deciding what kind of war he was willing to fight. There is a moment in war when a man looks at what he has just done and must decide what kind of man he intends to remain. For Herbert Schultze, that moment came not once, but repeatedly, in the grey and merciless expanse of the North Atlantic. He had done his duty. A ship had gone down. The sea was doing what the sea always does, taking what it could, coldly and without preference. And Schultze, standing at the bridge of U-48 with the wreckage still settling below the horizon, chose to do something that no protocol required, no superior had ordered, and no tactical logic could fully justify. He reached for the radio. What happened in those moments has passed into the mythology of the Second World War, but it did not begin as mythology. It began as a practical decision made under uncomfortable circumstances. The early months of the war still carried the faint procedural ghost of prize rules. The old conventions of naval warfare that required a submarine to surface, to warn a vessel, to ensure the safety of its crew before destruction. Those rules were already eroding under the pressure of operational reality and Donitz's push toward unrestricted tonnage war. Schultze understood the direction things were moving. He had read the orders and the shifting guidance from above, as well as any officer in the fleet. But understanding the direction of travel and being at ease with where it led were, for him, two different things. The act that defined his reputation unfolded in the weeks following the outbreak of war. Having sunk a British merchant vessel in the Atlantic, Schultze transmitted a signal that was received by the British Admiralty, direct, clear, and astonishing in its content. He gave the position of the survivors. He requested that rescue vessels be dispatched to the location. He did not dress it up, did not append explanations or justifications. He simply provided the coordinates and asked that someone come for the men in the water. Then he submerged and continued his patrol. The signal landed in British Naval Command, like a message from a different war entirely, one that the officers receiving it had perhaps not expected to be fighting. It is worth pausing on what this act required of him in practical terms, because it was not without cost. Transmitting on radio exposed his position. Every signal sent from a U-boat was a beacon for Allied direction-finding equipment, however imprecise that technology remained in the early war period. To transmit at all was to accept a degree of risk, and to transmit a navigational position was to place that risk in service of the enemy's capacity to act on it. His crew knew what a radio signal meant in terms of their own vulnerability. Schultze knew it too. He sent the message anyway, not once, but on more than one occasion across different patrols, whenever he judged that survivors were in mortal danger and unable to help themselves in the open ocean. The British response carried its own particular texture of bewilderment. Naval officers, accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of submarine warfare, in which lifeboats were simply a feature of a sinking scene, not a commander's ongoing concern, found themselves processing communications that did not fit the framework they had been given. Some within the Admiralty reportedly received the signals with a mixture of suspicion and grudging acknowledgement. Was it a trap? A ruse to lure a rescue vessel into a kill zone? The possibility had to be considered, and was considered, with the seriousness that wartime intelligence demanded. But the positions checked out. The survivors were where Schultze said they were. Rescue vessels dispatched to those coordinates found men alive who might otherwise have died of exposure before the slow machinery of chance brought help to them. The British press eventually caught the story, or enough of a version of it, to construct a narrative the public could hold on to. The name they gave him, the Gentleman of the Atlantic, carried the particular English flavor of surprised admiration, the kind reserved for a surprising adversary. There was something almost chivalric in the framing, and that framing was not entirely accidental. Britain in the early war years had a complicated relationship with the image of the enemy it was fighting. The rank cruelty of the regime in Berlin was well understood, but individual German officers, who behaved with what the British press interpreted as honor, could be accommodated within a storytelling tradition that stretched back to Napoleonic-era notions of the officer and the gentleman. Schultze slotted into that tradition neatly, whether he intended to or not. What was actually happening inside Schultze's thinking remains harder to reconstruct than the acts themselves. He left no detailed personal manifesto explaining his reasoning, no private diary entry recovered and quoted in post-war accounts that lays out a philosophical position. What survives is the pattern of behavior, repeated, deliberate, consistent, and the inferences that pattern invites. He appears to have held a distinction in his mind between the destruction of ships, which was warfare, and the abandonment of men to certain death in the ocean, which was something else. That distinction is not formally encoded anywhere in his record. It seems to have been an internal line, privately maintained, that he refused to let the war erase. The moral context surrounding those decisions deserves honest examination. The same U-48 that transmitted survivor positions to the Admiralty was also sending hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean. The same commander who asked for rescue vessels was simultaneously participating in a campaign designed to sever Britain's supply lines and starve its war effort into collapse. These two facts sit in the same sentence without cancelling each other out. Schultze's acts of mercy did not transform the nature of what the U-boat campaign was. They existed alongside it, gestures of individual conscience made within a system of industrialized destruction that required no individual conscience to function and did not pause on his account. The reactions within the Kriegsmarine itself were varied and, for the most part, quietly noted rather than loudly expressed. Dönitz ran a service that valued aggression, tonnage, and the psychological hardening required to operate in one of the most unforgiving combat environments in the war. Open sentimentality toward the enemy had no place in his doctrine and would not have been well received had it been framed that way. But Schultze's radio signals were not framed as sentimentality. They were presented, where they were presented at all, as the actions of an officer who retained a sense of professional conduct, an interpretation that allowed them to be absorbed without demanding a formal response from above. No reprimand appears in his record. No order came down forbidding the practice, in terms specifically aimed at him. The command appears to have looked, and then looked elsewhere. Among other U-boat commanders, Schultze's behavior registered on a spectrum. Some admired it quietly. Others found it difficult to square with the demands of the war they were being asked to fight. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a place that easily accommodated gestures, and men who watched friends and crewmates lost to depth charges and air attack were not always inclined toward generosity about the welfare of enemy merchant sailors. The war had its own momentum, and that momentum ran in a direction that did not naturally produce the kind of signals Schultze was transmitting. His refusal to fully surrender to that momentum made him anomalous. Not a rebel, not a dissenter, not a man who refused his orders or sabotaged his mission, but a man who carried something extra inside the machinery of the war, something the machinery had not required and could not quite account for. The men he saved likely never knew his name, or knew it only later, through the strange pathways of post-war memory and historical reconstruction. They were merchant sailors, mostly, civilian men crewing supply vessels who had no particular quarrel with anyone and found themselves in the wrong ocean at the wrong time. A cook from Newcastle, an engineer from Glasgow, a deckhand who had never wanted anything more complicated than to earn his wages and return to a specific street in a specific city. The war had placed them in lifeboats in the middle of the Atlantic, and the man responsible for putting them there had chosen to tell someone where they were. That transaction between a German submarine commander and an enemy naval command, conducted over open radio frequencies, in the middle of a war, with the sea doing nothing to help any of them, contains something that resists simple categorization. What the name the Gentleman of the Atlantic actually meant to Herbert Schultze himself is another question the record does not cleanly answer. Whether he wore it with pride, or heard it with a degree of discomfort, or simply accepted it as the kind of label a war produces for men who become symbols before they are finished being men, none of this is fully knowable. What is knowable is that the name followed him long after the patrols ended and the Atlantic had swallowed the war it had witnessed. And whatever its weight to him personally, it pointed towards something real. In a campaign measured almost entirely in tonnage and loss, in a service culture that elevated the efficient and the ruthless, a man had looked at the survivors of his own violence and reached for the radio. The Atlantic is a vast and impersonal place. He chose, more than once, to refuse to let it be. There is a phrase that passed between German submariners in those early months of 1940, spoken with the particular warmth of men who had survived enough hardship to recognize good fortune when it arrived. They called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. It was not an ironic expression. It was genuinely felt. A collective exhale from crews who had spent the closing months of 1939 navigating minefields, wrestling with faulty torpedoes, and probing the edges of an enemy still scrambling to find its footing. Now, suddenly, the sea felt different. The prey was abundant, the hunters were confident, and Herbert Schultze, aboard U-48, was moving through Atlantic waters with the quiet assurance of a man who had found his element entirely. The strategic conditions that produced this period had been shifting since the fall of France in June of 1940. With the capture of the French Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, the entire geometry of the U-boat war changed overnight. Before, German submarines had been forced to make exhausting transits around the northern tip of Scotland, simply to reach the open Atlantic, burning fuel and wearing out crews before they ever encountered a convoy. Now they departed from the Bay of Biscay directly, slicing days from their journey to the operational zones. The range they gained was not a minor tactical advantage. It was transformational. Boats that had once carried their fuel to the edge of usefulness before turning for home could now remain on patrol for extended periods, hunting across a vastly wider area of ocean. For a commander like Schultze, already skilled, already experienced, this was an opportunity of a kind that comes rarely in a fighting man's career. U-48 was by this point a known quantity within the U-boat arm, a boat with a growing record and a crew that had been tested and had held. The Type 7C submarine she would eventually become was the backbone of the Kriegsmarine's underwater fleet. But in her earlier configuration, U-48 had already proven herself a capable and durable fighting vessel. She was not luxurious. No U-boat was. The interior smelled permanently of diesel, damp clothing, unwashed men, and the particular metallic sourness of a sealed metal cylinder under pressure. Every surface was occupied. Bunks were shared in rotation, a system the crews called hot bunking, where a man climbing into a cot still warm from the man before him counted it a reasonable comfort. Food was edible at the start of a patrol and a trial by the end, and yet morale aboard U-48 under Schultze's command was, by all accounts of those who served with him, something more than the grim stoicism common to submarine crews. There was, in his boat, a particular steadiness. The patrols of 1940, built on one another, like successive chapters, in a story whose outcome still seemed genuinely open. Schultze took U-48 into Atlantic waters, with the accumulated knowledge of his earlier cruises, the feel of the convoys, their defensive patterns, the behavior of their escorts, and applied it with increasing precision. The tonnage mounted. Ship after ship was found, attacked, and sunk. These were not phantom numbers in a ledger. Each vessel represented a cargo hold: grain, oil, steel, ammunition, machinery, bound for a Britain fighting alone and dependent on the Atlantic supply line in a way that was quite literally existential. Every ton denied to British ports was a subtraction from an island nation's capacity to continue the war. Karl Dönitz had built his entire strategic philosophy around this arithmetic, and in 1940, his commanders were proving it with brutal effectiveness. Among those commanders, Schultze stood at or near the very top of the tonnage table. The precise accumulation of ships and gross registered tons is a matter of record, and the record is extraordinary, placing U-48 in the company of a very small number of submarines that inflicted damage measured not in individual encounters, but in a sustained, rolling campaign of destruction across months of active patrol. What is sometimes lost in the abstraction of statistics is the operational reality that produced them. Each sinking required a sequence of decisions made under pressure: the approach, the calculation of firing solution, the management of the crew during the attack, the post-attack evasion from whatever escort response came hunting. Schultze made these decisions repeatedly, correctly, and under conditions where a single error meant the boat did not come home. The wolf pack tactics that Dönitz had theorized before the war were beginning to take clearer shape during this period, though the coordination remained imperfect and communications still posed challenges that the Kriegsmarine was working hard to solve. The concept was straightforward enough in principle: spread submarines across a wide patrol line, wait for a convoy to be detected by one boat, then bring multiple attackers to bear before the escorts could effectively respond. Against the convoy system, the principal Allied defensive innovation, the pack was the intended counter. It overwhelmed escort screens that had been designed to handle single submarine threats. For the merchant captains and naval escort commanders struggling to hold convoys together in the North Atlantic, the autumn months of 1940 were among the most alarming of the entire war. Losses that had been painful became, in certain stretches, catastrophic. It was during the nights above all that the U-boats struck hardest. Surface attacks at night, made at close range against the dark silhouettes of merchant ships, were a technique Dönitz had developed with particular emphasis. A surface submarine at night was extremely difficult for a convoy's lookouts to spot, and it was faster on the surface than below, allowing commanders to maneuver for repeated attacks against multiple targets within a single convoy. The escorts, equipped with ASDIC sonar systems designed to hunt submerged contacts, were often left flailing when the attack was delivered from the surface at close quarters in poor visibility. Schultze understood and applied these methods. The happy time, for all its grimly celebratory name among the men who lived it, was in mechanical terms a period of refined and effective killing. And yet, even within this period of professional ascendancy, the man himself remained something other than the idealized warrior the propaganda newsreels required. Schultze's earlier decisions to radio the British Admiralty about survivors had not been anomalies or moments of weakness. They had been expressions of a consistent character that sat alongside his tactical competence rather than in contradiction to it. He was effective, and he was humane, and he appears to have seen no particular tension between the two. Within the U-boat arm, this combination was unusual enough to notice. Other commanders respected it without necessarily sharing it. His crew, knowing the kind of man who stood their watch, found in that knowledge a particular form of reassurance that no amount of official encouragement could replicate. The pressure on Britain through these months was immense, and clearly felt at every level of British society and government. Winston Churchill, who had come to power in May of 1940, understood with cold clarity that the Atlantic supply line was not merely important, but was in fact the entire war in another form. Lose the Atlantic, and the ability to sustain the fight collapsed. The numbers being absorbed by the U-boat arm were not losses a nation at war could absorb indefinitely. The merchant navy was losing ships faster than the shipyards were replacing them during the worst stretches of this period. The men on those vessels, largely civilian sailors from Britain, from the Commonwealth, from allied and neutral nations, were living with a fear that the naval histories tend to treat as statistical context, and that was, in reality, a constant and intimate companion on every Atlantic crossing. For Schultze, standing at the apex of this success, the professional satisfaction was real and would be foolish to deny. He was commanding a vessel he knew deeply, in waters where his skills were being fully exercised, at a moment when his service was doing precisely what it had been built to do. The Knight's Cross that was coming to him would acknowledge what the tonnage tables already demonstrated, and yet there is in the record of this period, read carefully, a quality to Schultze's conduct that resists the complete absorption into triumph. The radio messages to the British Admiralty had made him famous among his enemies as much as among his comrades. British sailors and officers who received those messages, and the press coverage that followed, were confronted with something the machinery of total war finds genuinely uncomfortable: an opponent who acknowledged your humanity while prosecuting your destruction. It complicated the necessary simplifications of wartime. Back in the ports, in Lorient now, with the new arrangements of the Biscay bases bringing a strange domesticity to the operational rhythm, the returning crews were received as something close to celebrities. The propaganda apparatus took great interest in the aces, in the tonnage scores, in the decorated commanders who could be placed before cameras and made to embody national confidence. Schultze moved through this world with visible competence and a certain contained reserve. He understood his duties, he fulfilled them. But those who knew him in this period describe a man who held the public performance at a slight distance from his private self, inhabiting the role of celebrated commander with the same steady control he brought to everything else. The happy time could not, of course, last. The word happy contains within it the knowledge of its own end, happiness being, by nature, a temporary condition in the middle of a war. The Allies were learning, the technology was shifting, the intelligence picture was beginning to change, in ways that neither Schultze nor Dönitz nor anyone else in the Kriegsmarine could yet fully perceive. But in 1940, on the North Atlantic, beneath a sky full of stars, or a sky full of rain, it still felt like the U-boats owned the water. And U-48, driven by a man who fought hard and slept with a conscience he appears to have kept largely intact, sat near the very summit of everything the German submarine service had achieved. The arithmetic of destruction was not yet done, but the sea that had given so much to the hunters was already, in the quietest possible way, beginning to prepare its answer. By the time Herbert Schultze relinquished command of U-48 in the summer of 1942, the tally of his operational patrols had elevated him to a category occupied by only a handful of men in the entire Kriegsmarine. Across multiple war patrols, operating first under the constraints of prize rules, and then, as the campaign intensified, under unrestricted submarine warfare, Schultze had sent more than 40 vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. The tonnage sunk, approaching 300,000 tons when measured by the exacting standards of German naval accounting, placed him squarely among the elite of the U-boat arms ace commanders. Yet the arc of his achievement unfolded differently than the mythology surrounding other high-scoring captains. Where some aces became synonymous with aggression or ruthlessness, Schultze's reputation settled into something more complex. A man whose operational record spoke of tactical brilliance and relentless efficiency, but whose conduct behind that efficiency marked him as something rarer in the annals of submarine warfare. The crew of U-48 formed the backbone of Schultze's operational success, and they would become the unit most closely associated with his command style. By the standards of the U-boat service, U-48 was an older boat, a Type Vic submarine, sturdy rather than fast, with a displacement of roughly 760 tons when submerged. The boat's interior was a labyrinth of narrow passages, compartments stacked vertically, and machinery that demanded constant attention from specialists trained to near telepathic coordination in absolute darkness. Forward lay the torpedo compartment, where 4 men might sleep in rotating shifts among the warheads themselves, a claustrophobic intimacy with the instruments of death that shaped the psychology of submarine crews in ways impossible to fully convey to those who had never served beneath the sea. Behind that compartment stretched the control room, the nervous system of the boat, where the diving officer, the helmsman, and the navigation team maintained the endless calculus of depth, trim, and heading. Further aft sat the engineering spaces, where the diesels roared to life on the surface and the electric motors whispered through the depths, and beyond them the stern torpedo room, where additional warheads waited and men worked in perpetual danger of flooding. The complement of U-48 numbered roughly 47 officers and enlisted men, representing a cross-section of German society brought together by naval service and seasoned by months of continuous combat operations. Unlike the stereotyped image of U-boat crews as fanatical ideologues, the men of U-48 included skilled tradesmen, educated men from middle-class backgrounds, former merchant sailors, and young conscripts whose technical competence mattered far more than their enthusiasm for National Socialism. Schultze's chief engineer, his navigator, his gunnery officer, and his watch commanders formed a team that had operated together across enough patrols to develop the instinctive understanding necessary to survive in the most dangerous hunting ground of the entire war. These were men who had learned to sleep while the boat groaned under depth charge attack, who had tasted their own fear in the suffocating darkness when the hull pressure tested the limits of riveted steel, and who had nonetheless maintained the discipline required to reload torpedoes, trim ballast tanks, and execute maneuvers that demanded split-second timing. The bond between Schultze and his officers, and between the officers and the ratings, manifested in a form of cohesion that visiting observers frequently noted in their assessments of the boat. What distinguished U-48 under Schultze's command was not the sophistication of its equipment or the novelty of its tactics, but rather the culture of meritocratic discipline and mutual respect that Schultze cultivated within the confined world of the submarine. Unlike some commanding officers, who ruled through fear or the invocation of Nazi party ideology. Schultze demanded excellence through clear explanation of objectives and scrupulous fairness in the distribution of duty and rest. Officers and men knew that Schultze would not order them to undertake operations that he did not himself understand in detail or approve on tactical grounds. His written orders and standing instructions, preserved in fragments through post-war interviews, reveal a man concerned with the welfare of his crew, with the maintenance of professional standards, and with the avoidance of unnecessary risk. He established a rotation system for critical watch stations that ensured no man spent more than a specified number of hours at the most exhausting positions. He maintained an unusual attention to the submarine's ventilation systems and air quality, understanding that a crew's morale and judgment deteriorated in a poisoned atmosphere. And he instituted a form of informal council among his senior ratings and junior officers, a practice almost unknown in the hierarchical Kriegsmarine. These were small things, individually, but in the aggregate, they created a submarine that functioned with an efficiency and a cohesion that translated directly into operational success. The esprit de corps aboard U-48 became legendary within the U-boat arm, the subject of envious talk in the bases and training facilities where other crews served. Men requested transfers to U-48 with such frequency that Schultze could afford to be selective in his crew assignments, a luxury few other commanding officers enjoyed. The boat's relatively high survival rate through multiple patrols, in an era when U-boat mortality was climbing to unsustainable levels, meant that a large proportion of the crew carried memory and experience accumulated across 5, 6, or 7 completed patrols. This institutional memory, the knowledge of how the boat itself behaved in various sea states, how the engines responded to emergency demands, and how Schultze reacted to different tactical situations, created a human system of extraordinary sophistication. When a new recruit arrived aboard, he faced not only the disorientation of submarine service, but also the unspoken expectation that he would learn quickly and execute his duties without diminishing the standards maintained by the rest of the crew. The new men, in turn, absorbed the culture so thoroughly that within 2 or 3 patrols, they were indistinguishable from the original crew in their commitment and competence. Schultze's operational record across his patrols aboard U-48 established the pattern that would define his reputation. His early successes, documented with the meticulous care that the Kriegsmarine applied to tonnage accounting, demonstrated a commander who possessed both the tactical judgment to locate convoys and the nerve to close within striking distance of escorted merchant shipping. As the war developed, and as Britain's defensive measures grew more sophisticated, successful attacks required increasing boldness and precision. Schultze adapted to the changing conditions, not by wild aggression, but by methodical analysis of the convoy routes, the patterns of escort deployment, and the vulnerabilities in the defensive screen. His patrols during the so-called happy time of 1940 yielded some of his highest tonnage scores. Vessels sunk in rapid succession as the U-boat arm operated in waters where the Allies had not yet fully consolidated their defensive measures. Yet even in those months of apparent triumph, Schultze maintained the habit of radioing the positions of survivors, an extraordinary gesture that began to separate his reputation from that of other aces, and would eventually earn him the sobriquet by which history would remember him. The emotional and psychological resilience required to maintain such a command style across years of warfare cannot be overstated. Schultze carried the weight of every decision that sent his crew into danger, and that weight compounded with each man lost from U-48 or from other boats under circumstances he might have influenced through his tactical choices and signals. The responsibility of commanding a submarine in wartime operated on a different scale than commanding surface vessels or land forces, because the intimacy of the submarine environment meant that Schultze existed in a state of constant proximity to his men's fears and doubts. He could not retreat to a commanding officer's quarters removed from the crew's spaces. He occupied the same recirculated air, drank the same rationed water, and endured the same sensory deprivation and stress. This intimacy, paradoxically, may have deepened his sense of obligation to them, making his meticulous attention to their welfare not merely a matter of professional good practice, but a form of moral necessity. Some of the men who served under Schultze carried photographs of him throughout the remainder of their lives, spoke of him decades after the war, with a reverence that transcended the normal bonds of military service, and credited him with having kept them alive not only through superior tactics, but through a kind of moral leadership that made them feel their survival mattered to someone who held their fate in his hands. The training roles that Schultze assumed after his last operational patrol with U-48 reflected the value the Kriegsmarine placed on his experience and his character. Senior commanders, including Karl Dönitz himself, recognized that preserving experienced officers for training duties was a more efficient use of human capital than allowing them to be sunk in combat as the odds against U-boat survival lengthened. Schultze transitioned into positions where he could directly shape the preparation of the generation of commanders and crews who would carry forward the U-boat war in its final and most desperate phases. The young officers and men who trained under Schultze absorbed not only his technical knowledge, but also his approach to command, his insistence on professionalism, and his evident belief that the proper conduct of war did not require the surrender of one's humanity. In the training establishments and the operational briefing facilities where Schultze worked, he became a living example of how a U-boat could be effectively commanded without recourse to terror or fanaticism. His very presence in these roles carried weight, because everyone in the service knew his record, and when Schultze advocated for certain training methods or tactical doctrines, his words carried the authority of a man whose practical success in combat was beyond dispute. The statistics of Schultze's career, the tonnage sunk, the number of patrols completed, the vessels sent to the bottom, are ultimately no more than numbers unless they are placed in the context of what it cost him and what it cost the men under his command. U-48, under Schultze, lost crew members across the years of its operation, some in combat, some to accident, some to the simple accumulation of stress and exhaustion that the submarine service inflicted on human beings. Each loss registered on Schultze in ways that were perhaps invisible to observers ashore, but that contributed to the gradual tightening of his face, the deepening of the lines around his eyes, and the reserve that increasingly characterized his bearing. By the time he relinquished active command of U-48, Schultze had undergone the transformation that war inflicts on those who take seriously the responsibility they bear for other men's lives. He remained outwardly professional, even serene, but those closest to him understood that the lightness and confidence of his early patrols had been replaced by a certain gravity, a sense that he now carried within himself the accumulated weight of all the choices he had made and all their consequences. The myth of the U-boat ace, the lone wolf commander striking fear into enemy convoys, the perfect predator of the deep, bears little resemblance to the complex human reality of Schultze's command experience. He was indeed a highly effective tactical commander, a man whose patrols produced results that the Kriegsmarine's records and the official chronicles of the Battle of the Atlantic confirm beyond any doubt. Yet effectiveness in submarine warfare during the Second World War did not require indifference to human suffering, and in Schultze's case, his operational success coexisted with a visible commitment to reducing that suffering where it lay within his power. His crew noticed this, and it shaped their willingness to follow him into dangers that would have broken the cohesion of less well-led submarines. His peers in the U-boat service noted it, and it contributed to the respect in which he was held both during the war and in the complex retrospectives that would occupy the post-war years. His enemies noted it as well, particularly the British naval officers, who heard his radio transmissions calling for rescue of survivors, and who would later, in the strange intimacy that sometimes develops between professional opponents in war, come to regard him with a respect that transcended the normal categories of national antagonism. By the close of his combat patrols, Schultze had become not merely an ace of the deep, but a figure whose legacy would hinge not solely on tonnage sunk, but on the question of how a man sustains his own humanity while commanding instruments of destruction in an industrial war. By the autumn of 1941, Herbert Schultze had become inconvenient to ignore. U-48 had claimed more than 40 vessels across multiple patrols, her tonnage record climbing with each Atlantic crossing. The men under his command spoke of him with an unusual respect that seemed to transcend the normal hierarchy of military obedience. The German press had begun to whisper about the U-boat captain who radioed enemy positions, and Berlin's propaganda apparatus smelled an opportunity. Here was a war hero with an irresistible story, the young commander whose courage and tactical brilliance were matched only by his sense of chivalry, a gentleman waging warfare according to codes his enemies could respect. The Nazi leadership understood such narratives could be weaponized for morale at home and for the carefully constructed image of German military honor abroad. But the machinery that moved toward Schultze carried an implicit demand he had not sought and could not easily refuse. Recognition in the Third Reich was never merely recognition. It came bundled with expectations, with the need to appear, to speak, to embody whatever values the state needed the moment to represent. The Knight's Cross arrived first, the physical manifestation of official acknowledgement. To receive this medal was to join a brotherhood of the war's most effective and celebrated commanders, men whose names were known in every German household, whose photographs appeared in newspapers alongside carefully composed tributes to their skill and, more importantly, to the regime, their ideological commitment. The bestowing of the Knight's Cross was a state theatre, each decoration a performance in the larger drama of Nazi cultural production. Schultze would have understood what acceptance meant, not merely an honor, but an assignment. He was now property of a sort, at least in the eyes of the propaganda ministry. His image would be circulated, his story altered and simplified, his wartime decisions reinterpreted through the lens of National Socialist ideology. The regime needed heroes, because heroes inspired the young men still arriving at U-boat schools, and because heroes on the front pages distracted the population from shortages, from losses, from the creeping realization that the war was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. The Knight's Cross transformed Schultze from a soldier doing his duty into something more useful and more dangerous, a symbol. What follows in the historical record is curious, and to those who study it carefully, deeply revealing. Schultze appears in photographs from this period, with a visible tension in his posture, a guardedness in his expression that suggests discomfort rather than pride. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who seemed to revel in the attention, who posed eagerly for photographers, and spoke in the expansive rhetoric of German racial superiority and historical destiny, Schultze gave the impression of a man who would prefer to be anywhere else. Contemporary accounts describe him as polite but distant, cooperative but offering nothing beyond what duty required. He submitted to interviews and public appearances, because refusing them would have invited precisely the kind of suspicion the regime reserved for those who seemed reluctant to celebrate their own achievements. The propaganda ministry's scripts required certain phrases, certain invocations of faith in final victory and gratitude toward the Führer, and Schultze delivered them with the flat delivery of a man reading from a document, rather than speaking from conviction. Those close enough to observe him during this period noted something that the official records could not capture: a fundamental absence of enthusiasm, a sense that whatever fires burned in him during combat patrols had cooled considerably when confronted with the apparatus of state glorification. The contrast becomes sharper when one examines the behavior of other celebrated U-boat commanders during the same period. Men like Günther Prien, whose sinking of the Royal Oak in 1939 made him perhaps the first true U-boat celebrity, threw themselves into the role with genuine fervor. Prien appeared at rallies, spoke before crowds, gave interviews that seemed to crystallize the regime's vision of a warrior elite, animated by ideological commitment and absolute confidence in ultimate victory. The photographs of such men convey an alignment, however calculated or genuine, between personal ambition and state ideology. Schultze's photographs tell a different story. They show a professional soldier, technically excellent and operationally effective, but fundamentally separate from the political machinery that sought to claim him as one of its own. This distinction mattered, and the regime, which was exquisitely attuned to questions of loyalty and ideological fervor, appears to have noticed it. The documentation suggests that while Schultze was never subjected to suspicion or investigation, while he continued to receive opportunities for advancement, he was also never quite fully absorbed into the celebratory apparatus, the way certain other decorated commanders were. The mechanics of this dynamic reveal something crucial about how frontline officers navigated the intersection of military service and totalitarian politics. A U-boat captain who had survived multiple patrols, who had earned the trust of his crew through competence and fairness, rather than ideological zeal, occupied a peculiar position. He had demonstrated his value to the state through his actions at sea, through tonnage sunk and strategic effectiveness, which was precisely the metric by which the regime measured success. Yet the regime also demanded a kind of enthusiastic alignment, an eager participation in the narrative of historical inevitability and racial supremacy that animated National Socialist thought. For many officers, these demands existed in tension, and the strategies for managing that tension varied. Some compartmentalized ruthlessly, maintaining professional standards at sea while performing ideological commitment on shore. Others seemed to genuinely believe both, or at least to convince themselves they did. Schultze appears to have been incapable of either approach. His reputation for taking care of his crew, for treating even enemy sailors with consideration, suggests a man whose moral framework operated according to older principles of military honor and conduct, principles that predated and were arguably incompatible with the totalitarian demands of the Third Reich. The question of Schultze's relationship with Nazi ideology remains imperfectly documented, as such questions often do. What survives in the record are fragments, the absence of ideological rhetoric in his known writings, the testimony of men who served under him, describing him as a captain, concerned with seamanship and crew welfare rather than political instruction, the visible discomfort in his public appearances once he became a decorated hero. One must be cautious about reading too much into such silences and gaps. Officers of his generation had grown up under the Weimar Republic, had entered military service during the transition years of the early 1930s, and had been shaped by traditions of military professionalism that preceded National Socialism. Schultze's age and background meant he was not among the youngest cohort of officers, those who had received their entire formative education under Nazi governance and were more thoroughly indoctrinated into party ideology from childhood onward. Yet he was not old enough to be completely insulated from the regime's cultural penetration either. The truth likely lies in a more complicated place than either extreme. A man who accepted certain fundamental assumptions of his society while maintaining internal reservations about others, who performed loyalty while preserving some core of private skepticism, who valued his professional identity and his obligations to his crew more than he valued participation in the grand historical narrative the state wished him to embody. The regime's effort to weaponize Schultze and men like him reveals something essential about how totalitarian states approach the problem of genuine achievement. The Nazi leadership could not create effective military commanders through ideology alone. They needed professionals, men trained in technical disciplines and capable of independent judgment under pressure. Yet they also needed these same men to function as propaganda assets, to validate the system through their very existence and success. The contradiction was inherent and ultimately irresolvable. The men most valuable militarily, those who thought clearly about problems, who questioned ineffective orders, who maintained focus on professional objectives rather than political ones, were often the least reliably ideological in their public presentation. Schultze embodied this contradiction. He was too useful to ignore, too valuable to sideline, yet apparently too disengaged from political ideology to be fully trusted. The propaganda apparatus made use of what they could extract from him, while accepting, perhaps with some frustration, that this particular hero would never quite deliver the total alignment they preferred. What makes Schultze's position particularly resonant is that his disengagement from ideology did not prevent him from functioning excellently within the military system. He received command of U-48 because of demonstrated competence, not because of party connections. His crew followed him because he ran an effective boat and looked after the men under his command, not because they had been indoctrinated into a shared revolutionary vision. His tactical decisions in combat were sound, not because they served the cause of National Socialism, but because they served the objective of success at sea. In other words, Schultze existed as proof that the military apparatus of the Third Reich could operate according to professional military logic that was substantially independent of political ideology, even though the regime would never have acknowledged this openly. To have done so would have undermined the totalitarian claim that politics and warfare were inseparable, that every action by every officer was ultimately an expression of the regime's will and ideology. Yet the evidence suggests that many frontline officers and men functioned precisely in this compartmentalized manner, maintaining professional standards and personal ethics that did not derive from or necessarily align with the doctrines they were theoretically required to serve. The machinery of state control and propaganda nonetheless continued to operate. Schultze was made available for public functions and ceremonial appearances. He was invited to speak before officer cadets at U-boat training facilities, though the content of such speeches remains largely unrecorded. He appeared at naval functions and social events, where he was expected to represent the officer corps and validate through his presence the efficacy of military leadership under the regime. The burden of such visibility should not be underestimated. A man accustomed to the relative clarity of command at sea, where orders could be clear and consequences immediate, now found himself navigating the far more ambiguous terrain of political society. Every statement could be misinterpreted or, more dangerously, correctly interpreted as insufficiently enthusiastic. Every appearance was an opportunity to err by either appearing too withdrawn or overstepping by expressing opinions that might be construed as skeptical of party doctrine. The safest strategy was the one Schultze appears to have adopted, show respect for the institution, fulfill the duties assigned to him, maintain professional courtesy in all interactions, but volunteer nothing of himself beyond what was strictly necessary. The contrast between Schultze's wartime conduct and his post-war positioning suggests that his acts of mercy toward the crews of vessels he had sunk may have represented more than tactical calculations or momentary compassion. They may have embodied a fundamental ethical commitment that existed independent of, and somewhat in opposition to, the totalitarian framework of the state he served. The regime wanted to celebrate his military effectiveness, while implicitly accepting the moral framework within which he operated. The rules of engagement, the consideration for non-combatants, the preservation of life where possible. Yet accepting Schultze as a model commander meant accepting that such principles could coexist with his being an excellent officer in the Nazi state's most elite military branch. This was a contradiction the propaganda apparatus could never fully resolve. It could emphasize his bravery and tactical skill, but it could not emphasize the humanitarian dimensions without raising awkward questions about how such humanitarian instincts related to the regime's actual policies and ideology. Better to keep him at a slight distance, to make use of his military reputation while leaving the deeper dimensions of his character unexamined. By 1942, as Schultze transitioned away from command at sea toward shore-based training and administrative responsibilities, his visibility in the propaganda apparatus appears to have diminished somewhat. He was no longer a figure on active combat patrols, no longer generating the fresh tonnage numbers and dramatic patrol reports that kept other U-boat commanders in the public eye. He remained decorated and respected, but he was also becoming part of the institutional furniture rather than a fresh symbol of current success. The regime's attention always moved toward the next generation of heroes, the next crews achieving unprecedented tonnage, the next victories that could be shaped into narratives of inexorable progress toward final triumph. Schultze became a reference point rather than a focal point, honored but no longer urgently needed for immediate propaganda purposes. In some ways, this may have been a relief, a reduction in the pressure to perform alignment with a state ideology he had never fully embraced. In other ways, it represented a slow diminishment of the particular kind of power that comes from being celebrated and publicly recognized. The man who had been inconvenient to ignore was becoming possible to overlook. What remained constant throughout this period was Schultze's professionalism and his fundamental integrity. He trained the next generation of U-boat commanders with the same attention to detail and concern for their welfare that had characterized his command at sea. He maintained discipline and standards within the institutions he served, without apparently allowing those institutions' political claims to distort his judgment about what effective military leadership required. He gave the regime the service it demanded from officers, without giving it the total ideological surrender some commanders offered, or that the regime would have preferred to extract. This was not quite resistance. He never overtly challenged state authority or questioned orders through official channels. It was something more subtle and perhaps more durable, the maintenance of a kind of professional independence, a refusal to allow the political claims of the state to completely colonize the space of moral judgment and professional conduct. Such independence was always precarious in the Third Reich, always subject to being misinterpreted, or worse, correctly interpreted, as insufficient loyalty. That Schultze navigated this space without apparent consequence until the very end of the war suggests either considerable political skill or, perhaps more likely, the recognition by those in authority that a man of his military value was worth accommodating, even if he would not fully surrender to the regime's ideological demands. The question of how much Schultze was aware of the larger crimes of the Nazi state, and how he reconciled knowledge of such crimes with his continued service, lies largely outside the historical record available to us. The later period of the war brought increasing evidence of the regime's true nature to those with eyes to see and ears to hear, particularly to officers with access to information and the education to contextualize it. The decision to continue serving a state one has come to recognize as criminally immoral is one of the great moral questions of the period, one that admits no easy answers, and about which historical judgment must remain measured and complicated. What seems clear is that Schultze's apparent detachment from Nazi ideology predated his awareness of such crimes, if such awareness came at all. His disengagement from the propaganda machinery and from enthusiastic alignment with party doctrine appears to have been rooted in a simpler and older set of values, a belief in military professionalism, in the care of subordinates, in conduct according to established codes of military honor, rather than in explicit opposition to the regime on political grounds. These values might seem modest compared to active resistance or overt dissent, yet in a totalitarian state, the quiet maintenance of alternative standards and the refusal to allow the state to completely determine one's conduct and judgment represented a kind of independence that was neither trivial nor entirely without moral. Every man has a moment when the weight he has carried for years shifts and settles elsewhere. For Herbert Schultze, that moment came not with fanfare or formal ceremony, but quietly, in the way most significant transitions do. The sea that had claimed so much of his life, and the lives of thousands of others under his command, would now be his to witness from the shore. By the winter of 1942, as the Battle of the Atlantic ground toward its terrible turning point, Schultze stepped back from active command. This was not retirement in the sense of withdrawal. Rather, it was a reassignment that reflected both his value and the strategic calculations of Karl Dönitz, who had come to understand that experienced commanders were as irreplaceable as the boats themselves. The U-boat arm was expanding at a rate that demanded not just new vessels, but men capable of training the next generation of submariners to survive in waters growing more lethal by the month. Schultze possessed something that no training manual could impart: the accumulated knowledge of survival, the instinct of a predator who had studied his prey with the discipline of a scientist. The decision to pull experienced commanders from the front line was not unusual. Dönitz had learned through bitter experience that U-boat captains burned out under the psychological strain of command at depths where a single mistake meant death for 50 or more men. The Commodore understood his crews in ways that few naval leaders of any nation truly did. He walked the docks and spoke to returning commanders, listened to their accounts not merely for tactical information, but to measure the state of their nerves, the reserve of will they could still draw upon. A man could only maintain that level of vigilance, that constant awareness of threats above and below and all around, for so long before the strain began to calcify into something harder and colder. Dönitz rotated his best men, partly out of mercy, partly out of practicality. When Schultze received his orders to assume a position at a U-boat training school, he was one of the most successful submarine commanders Germany possessed. Yet he was also a man whose combat patrols had become less frequent and whose own crew had aged with him. The transition from the front to the training establishment represented a kind of ascension in the military hierarchy, yet many men experienced it as a loss. The sea called to them in ways that land never could. The responsibility of command at the surface felt thin and abstract compared to the absolute reality of being submerged, where decisions made at that moment determined whether men lived or died in the next hour. The U-boat training schools of Germany were vast, intricate organizations designed to take recruits from civilian life and transform them into submarine personnel, capable of functioning in one of the most demanding environments known to warfare. The schools operated at several locations, with the most important facilities concentrated along the Baltic coast near Kiel and Danzig, cities that had shaped Schultze's own early military education decades before. Here, in the same waters where he had first learned naval discipline as a young officer, he would now teach others. The training pipeline had to produce not just sailors, but specialists of extraordinary sophistication. The diesel engine mechanics needed to understand their machines down to the last gasket and piston. The radio operators had to transmit and receive messages at speeds that left no margin for error. The torpedo men had to load weapons into their tubes with a choreography as precise as any dance, knowing that a fumbled round or a mechanical failure at the moment of firing could mean the failure of an entire patrol. The acoustic men listening through the hydrophones needed ears that could distinguish between the vibration of an enemy warship's screws and the background noise of the Atlantic itself. And the commanders had to master all of these disciplines themselves, while maintaining the mental clarity to navigate, hunt, and survive. No school could make these men overnight, but the right instructors could accelerate the process. Schultze brought something to the classroom that most officers could not: first-hand knowledge of what worked and what killed you. The psychological adjustment to shore posting, however, remained complex and not entirely resolved for most U-boat veterans. Schultze had spent the better part of 6 years in submarines, on patrols that lasted weeks at a time, breathing air thick with diesel fumes and human breath, surrounded by the constant metallic groaning of a pressure hull in motion. The monotony, punctuated by moments of absolute terror, had become his normal. On land, he found a world that had transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. German cities bore the scars of intensifying air raids. The confidence that had characterized the early war years had begun to erode. The news from distant fronts, Russia especially, carried overtones of something approaching desperation. The U-boat service itself was changing. The boats themselves were becoming faster and more capable, equipped with improved torpedoes and defensive armaments. Yet the men who crewed them were increasingly young and inexperienced. The losses were mounting in ways that made the losses of the happy time seem almost merciful by comparison. The war that Schultze had left at sea was one he understood in its bones. The war he came ashore to find was something more chaotic and less amenable to the discipline and calculation that had served him well. Training younger men offered him a way to remain useful, to believe that he was still contributing to something larger than himself, even as his own role in direct combat operations receded into the past. The culture of the training schools occupied a strange position within the broader U-boat arm. In one sense, instructors held authority that rivaled that of commanding officers at sea. A man who failed to meet the standards established at the training school would never get the chance to command a boat or even serve aboard one. The instructors held the power to remove candidates from the program, and they wielded that power with a mixture of pragmatism and severity. They could not afford sentimentality. Every man who graduated and proved deficient would jeopardize the lives of others when his inexperience manifested itself in combat. Yet in another sense, instructors occupied a secondary tier of prestige. The glory still belonged to those engaged in active operations. The men with the highest tonnage sunk, the commanders photographed in newspapers and celebrated in radio broadcasts, were those still hunting in the Atlantic. To move from the front to the classroom was to move away from the center of attention, however much the work mattered strategically. Schultze, however, appears to have accepted this transition with a degree of grace that not all men managed. His reputation was already secure, He did not need additional tonnage to establish his place in history. What he had was knowledge, and knowledge was what the training school required most urgently. The young men who would pass through his instruction had perhaps 10 to 15% chance of surviving their first full year of actual operations. Some of that was beyond his control. Some of it depended on luck, on whether their patrol coincided with a convoy or with a particularly active hunter-killer group. But some of it depended on whether they had internalized the lessons he could teach them. The instruction Schultze provided extended beyond pure technical or tactical training. The men who entered the U-boat service in 1943 and 1944 were different from the men who had served in 1940 and 1941. They were younger, often conscripted rather than volunteers, products of a generation that had known little peace in their adult lives. They came to the training schools with varying degrees of enthusiasm for the cause they were being asked to serve. What they universally brought was fear. Fear was the constant undercurrent in the classrooms and the practice vessels and the swimming pools where men practiced escaping from submerged capsules. Some of that fear was appropriate and necessary. A healthy fear of the ocean and of the enemy hunting you was a better survival mechanism than recklessness. But there was another kind of fear, the kind that could paralyze judgment in the moment it was most needed. Schultze's personal bearing offered a counterweight to that kind of fear. A man who had sunk hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping and lived to tell about it carried a kind of authority that could not be manufactured. When he told his students to trust their training, trust their equipment, and trust their commanding officer, the words carried weight, because Schultze had been all three of those things and had come through intact. The respect he commanded opened ears and minds in ways that lower-ranking instructors could not always manage. He was also, by most accounts, a patient teacher. The files of the training schools do not preserve much written record of Schultze's instruction, but the testimony of men who passed through his courses suggests someone who understood that fear needed to be channeled rather than simply overcome. The new boats coming out of German shipyards in 1943 and beyond were, in some ways, superior to the Type Vic U-boats that had dominated the early war. The Type 21 represented a revolutionary design with greater underwater speed and more advanced hydrophone equipment. Yet training men to operate such vessels carried its own complications. The crews had to learn not only new tactics, but entirely new understandings of how their boats behaved in the water. A young commander trained on one design could not simply transfer that knowledge to a newer boat without retraining. The technological curve was accelerating precisely at the moment when time was becoming scarce. Schultze found himself teaching not just ancient principles of submarine command, but also attempting to integrate his understanding of traditional U-boat doctrine with emerging capabilities he himself had never used in combat. This required a kind of intellectual flexibility that not all experienced commanders possessed. Some of the older generation became rigid, insisting that the old ways were the best ways, that their success in the Atlantic proved the superiority of their methods. Schultze appears to have avoided this trap. He was willing to learn from the younger men in turn, to understand the capabilities of the new boats, and to work that understanding into his teaching. This created a reciprocal relationship between instructor and student that enhanced both parties' preparation for the increasingly difficult contest ahead. The training schools themselves were becoming targets for Allied bombing as the air war intensified. The facilities along the Baltic were relatively protected compared to those closer to German population centers, but no location was truly safe. In 1943 and 1944, Allied strategic bombing was expanding its reach and its precision. An airfield attacked last month could be rebuilt and operational again within weeks, but a training facility destroyed took longer to resurrect, and the loss of instructors and students to air raids was a constant hazard. Schultze would have experienced this vulnerability directly. The security surrounding the training schools was serious, but could not be absolute. The men working there lived with the knowledge that an alarm could sound, and they would have mere minutes to reach shelter before bombs began falling. This background level of physical danger, paradoxically, may have reinforced the training mission in the minds of those undertaking it. If death was coming, it could come either in the Atlantic or over the Baltic. The difference was that in the training school, one had the possibility of preparing the next generation for their encounter with it. The men trained by Schultze and other experienced commanders at least had the benefit of knowing what they were preparing for. The abstract threat of enemy attack from the air was something else entirely. What distinguished Schultze's approach to training was reportedly a particular emphasis on the ethical dimensions of submarine command. The gentlemanly reputation he had earned through his radioed requests for rescue of survivors had not faded. If anything, it had become more significant as the war ground on, and stories of atrocities and ruthlessness from various theaters accumulated. Young commanders, learning the trade from Schultze, learned not merely how to sink ships, but how to do so in ways that preserved something of the humanity of those involved. This teaching was countercultural within certain circles of the Nazi military establishment, where ideology often displaced ethics, but it reflected something Schultze himself believed, that a man could be an effective warrior and still maintain his conscience. This was not pacifism or resistance. It was not an attempt to undermine the war effort. Rather, it was the instinct of a professional military man from an older tradition, who believed that standards of conduct mattered even in the brutality of modern warfare. How many of his students internalized this teaching and carried it into their own commands is impossible to determine with certainty. But the fact that it was taught at all, by so prominent a figure as Schultze, created space for a different kind of thinking within a military machine that often seemed to tolerate little dissent. By 1944, as the scope of German military defeat became impossible to deny, the training schools began to shift their emphasis towards something approaching desperation. The boats were no longer sent out with the expectation that they might return to port. Dönitz was asking his submarine men to undertake operations that had only the thinnest margin for success. The new generation was being trained not for victory, but for a kind of defiant last stand. Schultze, watching this transformation from the classroom, was witness to a profound shift in the nature of his mission. He was no longer training men to become successful hunters. He was training them to die with discipline and skill. This realization must have weighed on him in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. The pride he had taken in his own successes, in the professional competence of his crews, in the operational achievements of the U-boat service, began to feel hollow when those achievements were being consciously sacrificed in the final months of a war everyone understood was lost. The psychological cost of this knowledge, for Schultze and for all experienced commanders aware of the true strategic situation, was profound. Yet the training continued. Men continued to be graduated from the schools. Boats continued to be dispatched. The machinery of the U-boat service kept running, because the machinery of the German state demanded it, because stopping would constitute an admission of defeat that the regime could not tolerate. Schultze remained in his position, teaching, training, preparing men for missions whose outcome was already decided before the boats left port. The final months of Schultze's time ashore, before the collapse of Germany itself made further operations impossible, were spent in an increasingly surreal environment. The war was everywhere, in the news reports, in the visible destruction of German cities, in the faces of refugees moving westward ahead of the advancing Soviet armies. Yet the training schools continued their work. with a kind of mechanical persistence. Schultze was now a man living between worlds, the world of his wartime achievements and reputation, which gave him status and authority, and the world of imminent defeat, which rendered that status increasingly abstract. He had survived the war at sea, largely intact, physically at least. His mind carried the scars of command, the weight of decisions that had sent men to their deaths, and the moral complexity of having sent them in the service of a cause he appears to have viewed with increasing skepticism. The training school offered him a way to remain useful, to believe that the work he was doing had value beyond mere continuation, for continuation's sake. Whether that belief was fully justified, or whether it was a kind of necessary fiction that allowed him to function in an impossible situation, remains a question that history cannot fully resolve. What is certain is that by 1942, Herbert Schultze was no longer at sea. The boy from Kiel, who had learned to command the Atlantic depths, had been withdrawn from operational duty, his combat patrols concluded, his record secured in the annals of the Kriegsmarine. He had given the service 6 years of unrelenting effort, 6 years compressed into hours of tension, minutes of triumph, and long stretches of monotonous danger. Now he watched from shore as the machinery of war ground forward without him, and what he witnessed during this period was nothing short of a slow unraveling. The happy time, that extraordinary period of German submarine dominance that had seemed endless in 1940, was fading. The Atlantic itself had changed. The waters that had belonged to the U-boats were beginning to belong less certainly to them with each passing month. Schultze was not the only U-boat commander to notice this shift. From offices and training schools across occupied France and Germany, former aces were receiving reports that painted a picture of steady, relentless erosion. The war at sea was entering a new and pitiless phase. The transformation began not with a single dramatic reversal, but with a series of quiet improvements, each one building upon the last. The British had never stopped thinking about the submarine threat. While the U-boat arm celebrated the sinkings of merchant vessels and the strangling of British supply lines, the scientific and naval establishments in Britain were engaged in a different kind of war, one fought with mathematics, engineering, and ruthless ingenuity. The convoy system, which the Germans had learned to work around through the wolf-pack tactics pioneered by Dönitz, was being refined. Ships were being bundled together in tighter formations, protected by escorting warships equipped with newer detection equipment. These improvements had begun gradually, almost imperceptibly, but by 1942 they were becoming impossible to ignore. The British were training their escort crews with greater discipline and coordination. Anti-submarine tactics that had been experimental in 1940 were becoming standard practice by 1942 and beyond. The wolf packs, which had operated with such devastating freedom during the happy time, found their quarry defended now with tactics that had no answer yet. But the greatest threat to the U-boat came from above. As 1942 progressed, the waters of the Atlantic saw an increasing presence of aircraft. These were not the occasional patrol planes that had occasionally hindered operations during the early years of the war. These were long-range bombers and patrol aircraft, consolidated Catalinas, Lockheed Hudsons, and other four-engined machines that could fly for 10 or 12 hours, covering vast stretches of ocean that had previously been safe havens for submerged raiders. The introduction of these aircraft represented a fundamental shift in the battle for the Atlantic. A U-boat on the surface, charging its batteries or making transit to or from patrol areas, had always been vulnerable to surprise attack. Every captain knew this. But with few air patrols during the early war, the risks had been calculated and manageable. As Allied air power grew, those calculations shifted. A captain, surfacing in daylight, now had to scan the sky constantly, knowing that a distant speck could transform into a lethal missile within minutes. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had grown accustomed to the dangers of depth charges and ramming were now forced to reckon with an entirely different type of threat, sudden, from the air, and offering little time for evasion or defense. The detection equipment itself was also advancing in ways that even German intelligence was slow to fully appreciate. The British possessed a system called ASDIC, a sonic detection apparatus that could locate a submerged U-boat within a range of several thousand yards. The technology was not infallible. It had been circumvented and would continue to be, but it represented a quantum leap in the ability to find and hunt submarines beneath the waves. For years, German U-boat commanders had relied on stealth and darkness to avoid detection. The assumption was that a submerged boat, moving slowly and quietly, was nearly invisible to the enemy. ASDIC shattered this assumption. Suddenly, a U-boat captain had to reckon with the possibility that his boat had been detected even though no visual contact had been made. The sense of security that had characterized U-boat operations began to erode. Depth charges fell around boats in patterns that seemed less random, more coordinated, guided by a detection technology that commanders did not fully understand. The technical intelligence war proceeded in parallel with the tactical one, and Germany was gradually losing ground on both fronts. In the summer of 1942, Schultze and his fellow commanders received a piece of information that should have warned them all of what was coming. The British Admiralty had been reading German naval codes. This fact, which would not be widely known until after the war, was already beginning to shape the balance of power on the Atlantic. The code-breaking effort, centered at Bletchley Park, had produced intelligence that allowed the British to understand U-boat movements with uncanny precision. Convoys were being routed away from wolfpack concentrations. Anti-submarine hunter groups were being positioned to intercept German submarines. When a U-boat sank a ship, the location and circumstances were often already known to British command, and they could plan their response accordingly. The wolfpacks, which had seemed to move with such coordination and effect, were being led into traps, of which they were entirely unaware. From the German perspective, it appeared as though British luck was improving. From the British perspective, it was not luck at all, it was knowledge. The strategic situation was tilting, and the implications were beginning to become clear to thoughtful men, like Schultze, who had the education and experience to understand the broader patterns of the war. The psychological temperature of the U-boat service was changing as well. During the happy time, there had been a sense of purpose and momentum. Men volunteered for submarine service because the boats were winning. Promotions came quickly for successful captains and crews. There was esprit de corps, a sense of belonging to an elite arm that was striking blows against the British enemy. By 1942, this atmosphere was shifting almost visibly. Casualty rates were climbing. A U-boat that had been deployed to the Atlantic with the expectation of success now had a markedly reduced chance of returning intact. Officers like Schultze, who maintained contact with serving captains and crews through training and administrative roles, could read these changes in the letters and conversations of men still at sea. The confidence was being replaced by a kind of fatalistic acceptance. The war, which in 1940 had seemed as though it might be won through attrition of British shipping, now looked like something else entirely, a grinding, protracted conflict in which Germany's numerical disadvantages in industrial capacity and manpower would eventually prove decisive. Dönitz himself was aware of these shifting realities, though his public posture remained one of confidence and determination. The U-boat commander-in-chief maintained his faith in the strategic value of the tonnage war, even as the conditions for prosecuting it became increasingly unfavorable. He pushed for more boats, faster boats, boats with better armament and endurance. He believed that with sufficient numbers, the U-boat arm could still accomplish its strategic objectives. But even Dönitz, for all his tactical brilliance and iron will, was beginning to confront the reality that the technological balance was moving against him. The Allies were not only defending better, they were innovating faster. New detection systems would appear, and before German submarines could be fitted with countermeasures, another generation of Allied equipment would already be in development. It was a race that Germany was losing. For Schultze, watching these developments from the training schools and administrative posts where he spent 1942 and beyond, there must have been a particular kind of frustration. He had proven himself in combat. He understood the capabilities and limitations of submarines with the intimacy of a man who had lived in them under stress. He could see that the assumptions underlying the entire U-boat strategy were being undermined by forces largely beyond German control or comprehension. The service that had been his life, that had offered him purpose and community and the respect of his peers, was beginning a long, slow decline. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Schultze does not appear to have engaged in denial about these trends. His later reflections on the war suggest a man who understood the magnitude of what was happening, who recognized that the turning point had come, and who confronted that knowledge without sentimentality. The year 1942 was therefore a kind of watershed. It was not yet Black May, the catastrophic month of 1943, when U-boat losses would mount to such heights that Dönitz would be forced to withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic. It was not yet the period of complete tactical desperation that would characterize the final 2 years of the war, but it was the moment when the trajectory began to bend downward, the moment when the men who understood the sea and submarines and the technical dimensions of naval warfare could sense that the game was being played against them now, with increasing skill and increasing force. The waters of the Atlantic were still deadly for merchant shipping. German submarines would continue to sink vessels, would continue to take their toll, would continue to pose a strategic threat to British and American supply lines. But the aura of invincibility had departed. The U-boats were no longer the hunters in the traditional sense. They were becoming hunted, and the hunters were learning their trade with lethal efficiency. A Schultze would not serve at sea again after his early patrols on U-48. In this, he was fortunate, spared the fate that would claim so many of his brother officers, the suffocation in a crushed hull, or the hypothermia of an Atlantic night, the endless succession of depth charge attacks that wore men down over hours and days until even the strongest nerves could break. But this safety came at a cost. He was removed from the arena in which he had proven himself, compelled to observe the deterioration of his service from a position of impotence. He could train young men for a war that was progressively becoming less winnable. He could listen to reports from captains still at sea, absorbing the incremental tales of increasing difficulty. He could reflect, as thoughtful men do, on the decisions that had brought them to this point, and on the decisions that would shape what came next. The Atlantic that he had once commanded was returning to the enemy, slowly, but with the inevitability of a tide. For a man of honor and professional pride, watching this reversal unfold could not have been anything other than deeply, privately painful. By the close of 1942, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had once feared that the U-boat threat might strangle Britain into submission, could see clearly that the worst dangers had passed. The margin had not yet widened sufficiently to declare victory. That would come only in the following year, but the trajectory was visible to trained eyes. The merchant marine losses, while still catastrophic, were no longer mounting at the rates that had characterized 1940 and 1941. New ships were being built faster than old ones were being sunk. The convoy system was evolving and becoming more effective. The detection and destruction of U-boats was becoming a science, with repeatable, reliable results. For Dönitz and the U-boat commanders still at sea, for officers like Schultze watching from shore, for the young submariners training for patrols they might not survive, the meaning was clear. The war at sea had entered a new phase, and it was not the phase that Germany had planned for or could hope to win. The Atlantic still held the power of the deep, the mystery of the abyss, the possibility of sudden violence and unexpected mercy. But it no longer belonged to the wolf packs. That possession was passing to other hands, other nations, other methods of war that would eventually prove overwhelming. The year is 1943, and the Atlantic has become a graveyard. For nearly 3 years, the U-boats have ruled these waters with an almost unopposed ferocity, their grey hulls slipping through darkness to hunt merchant convoys with predatory patience. The crews who man them have been forged into a brotherhood of the depths, men who learn to read the ocean's moods and the sound of a destroyer's propellers as instinctively as they breathe. But by the spring of this year, something fundamental has shifted. The balance that once favored the hunter is beginning to tip toward the hunted, and no one aboard the U-boats quite understands yet how completely the war beneath the waves has turned against them. What follows will be remembered not as a battle, but as a reckoning. In a single month, the month of May, the Kriegsmarine will lose U-boats and men at a rate of attrition that will break the back of the Wolfpack offensive forever. This is the story of that catastrophe, and of the moment when the gentlemen commanders and their crews discovered that invincibility is a condition that cannot outlast the evolution of war itself. The causes of this collapse were already in motion when May arrived. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, the Allies had been quietly accumulating advantages that the Germans, trapped in the certainties of their own earlier successes, failed fully to appreciate. The British had broken into the German naval enigma codes more completely, allowing convoy routes to be shifted away from known Wolfpack positions. American shipyards had begun producing merchant vessels faster than the U-boats could sink them, a calculus that would eventually become mathematically insurmountable. Aircraft, those terrible enemies of the submerged boat, were ranging farther into the Atlantic, their long-range patrols eliminating the air gaps that had once been safe havens where U-boats could surface to recharge batteries and repair damage. The introduction of improved sonar equipment, particularly the ASDIC systems, refined through months of bitter trial and error, meant that a surfaced U-boat, or one at periscope depth, could now be detected by escort vessels with a precision that older methods had never achieved. Radar, too, had become more sophisticated and more widely distributed among British and American warships, allowing them to acquire targets in darkness and bad weather when the U-boats had once counted on invisibility. And then there were the small aircraft carriers, the escort carriers, that began appearing with convoys, carrying a handful of swordfish biplanes that could pursue U-boats across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. For the first time in the war, the hunter was being hunted with tools that matched, and often exceeded, his own. Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, watched these developments with growing unease. Dönitz was not a man given to self-deception. He was a meticulous officer who trusted in data and in the professional judgment of his commanders. Throughout the winter of 1942 and early 1943, the losses had been climbing in ways that contradicted the optimism of the propaganda ministry and the expectations of the High Command. Boats that had completed their patrols and reported safely had begun failing to make their rendezvous points. Radio operators would report positions, and then silence. Nothing but the empty hiss of the ether where a crew of 50 or 60 men should be reporting in. The mathematics of attrition were becoming unmistakable, whereas in 1940 and 1941, the U-boat fleet could replace its losses and still grow in overall numbers. By 1943, production could barely keep pace with destruction, and soon it would fall behind. Donitz pressed for new weapons, new technology, boats with improved armament and acoustic capabilities that might restore the balance. But these would take time to develop and deploy. And time was something the U-boat arm no longer possessed in abundance. The older boats, the Type 5V submarines that formed the backbone of the fleet, were becoming increasingly vulnerable to tactics and equipment they had never faced before. By the beginning of May, Donitz had roughly 40 U-boats positioned across the Atlantic in organized wolf-pack formations. The packs operated under radio direction from German command centers, receiving orders about the location of convoys and the coordinates where attacks were to be coordinated. This system of centralized command had worked brilliantly during the happy time, allowing the wolf packs to concentrate overwhelming force on vulnerable convoys and achieve devastating results. But that same system had become a source of terrible vulnerability. The radio signals that coordinated the wolf packs could be intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. More critically, the radio direction-finding equipment that the British had developed, their Huff-Duff stations, could locate the precise position of a U-boat simply from the signals it transmitted. Every time a U-boat captain reported his position to command or requested orders, he was broadcasting his location to the enemy. It was a trap disguised as a system of control, and in May, the Allies would spring that trap with systematic, crushing efficiency. The month began with a series of engagements that seemed, at first, to follow the familiar pattern. On the 7th of May, a wolf pack attacked convoy ONS-5, a slow eastbound convoy of merchant vessels carrying supplies to Britain. The battle raged across 3 days and nights, with U-boats and escort vessels fighting in conditions of rising chaos and confusion. But what differed now was that the escort vessels, acting on intelligence about the wolf pack's position, had been reinforced. New support groups could be called in, rushing to the point of contact and arriving within hours rather than days. Aircraft from escort carriers could maintain patrols overhead, forcing U-boats to dive and lose contact with their prey. One by one, the U-boats engaged at convoy ONS-5 found themselves harried, damaged, or sunk. Some captains attempted the old tactics, surfacing to use their superior speed to maneuver into attack positions, only to find that Allied aircraft now dominated these waters. Boats that survived the initial convoy fight found themselves isolated and pursued across the Atlantic by hunting groups that never relented, never lost contact, and eventually closed in for the kill. By the second week of May, the casualty rate had begun to accelerate sharply. 4 boats were lost in a single day, then 5. The wolf packs were supposed to concentrate force, but instead, concentration only meant more boats in the area where the enemy was waiting. The convoy battles of the 3rd week of May became exercises in attrition for the Germans, each engagement costing them another boat or two, while the convoys, though damaged, continued their journey. The escorts were learning to coordinate their attacks with surgical precision. When a U-boat was detected, the escort vessels would establish contact, maintain it relentlessly, and call in support from other ships or aircraft. Depth charges fell in patterns designed not just to sink the boat, but to damage it systematically, to rupture seals, to crack pressure hulls, to force the captain to choose between staying deep in water, so cold and dark that it would crush the boat, or surfacing to face the guns of the escort vessels. There was no escape anymore, no gap in the coverage, no sanctuary where a U-boat could repair and prepare for another attack. The psychological impact on the U-boat commanders cannot be overstated. These were men who had grown accustomed to a sense of tactical superiority, to the knowledge that they possessed advantages of speed, endurance, and the element of surprise. Now those advantages had evaporated. A U-boat on the surface was instantly vulnerable. A U-boat at periscope depth could be detected and attacked. A U-boat running silent at depth was slowly suffocating on its batteries, while the enemy hunted above. The old bromides about German superiority and National Socialist invincibility rang hollow in the crew's ears as boats failed to return from patrol, and the list of the fallen grew longer each day. Radio chatter among the wolf packs took on a note of desperation. Captains reported mechanical failures and requested permission to break off patrol. Others reported having been attacked multiple times and having exhausted their torpedo capacity. By the 22nd of May, Dönitz made the decision he had been resisting for weeks. He issued orders withdrawing the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The boats were to cease convoy attacks, regroup, and return to their bases. It was an admission of strategic defeat, though one that would be phrased in the official records as a tactical regrouping to implement new convoy tracking methods and to allow for maintenance and crew rotation. The human cost of May 1943 was staggering. Across the entire month, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats. 41 boats, each carrying between 45 and 60 men, depending on the class. That represented roughly 2,500 German sailors, drowned in the cold Atlantic, blown apart by depth charges, burned alive when their boats caught fire after being rammed or strafed by aircraft, or slowly suffocating in disabled submarines that could no longer surface. The survivors, those who were picked up by escort vessels or managed to struggle to life rafts, faced interrogation by British naval intelligence. Men who were often remarkably civil to their captives, but who extracted every scrap of information about U-boat capabilities, command structures, and operational procedures. The Germans in turn lost, for the first time in the war, the knowledge that their submarines were the dominant force in the Atlantic. Dönitz was a realist, and the data was unmistakable. The losses being sustained could not be sustained indefinitely. New technology might help, the snorkel, which would allow boats to run their diesel engines while submerged, and acoustic torpedoes designed to home in on escort vessel propellers, rather than requiring the captain to line up a shot visually. But all of these improvements lay months or years in the future, and the war was not going to wait. In the aftermath of May, a curious and unsettling mood settled over the U-boat service. The crews knew, because Dönitz had not hidden it from them, that new tactics would have to be adopted. Patrols would become even more dangerous. The old advantages had been forfeited. The boats would have to fight their way to the convoys, rather than approaching with impunity, and fight their way back after an attack, rather than slipping away into the darkness. The casualty rate among U-boat crews, already high by the standards of any other military service, would climb even higher. The average life expectancy of a German submarine in 1943 for a man who served aboard one of the operational boats was measured in months and then in weeks. Young men in their 20s and 30s, who had thought themselves part of an elite and invincible force, faced the knowledge that their next patrol might well be their last. Some boats continued to achieve successes after May, and some commanders would rack up impressive totals of tonnage sunk. But the aura of superiority, the confidence that the U-boats could strangle Britain into submission, was gone. It had been shattered in a single month by the relentless application of superior technology, superior intelligence, and superior coordination by an enemy that had finally learned how to hunt the hunter. For Herbert Schultze, Watching these events from shore, where his duties had taken him away from the front, the month of May 1943 represented a watershed. He had seen the High Command's confidence, had basked in the propaganda machinery's celebration of U-boat achievements, had understood himself as part of a winning service. Now that service was hemorrhaging, and the war at sea, which had seemed almost romantic in its simplicity, the individual skill of the captain against the vastness of the ocean, had become a grinding, technological attrition fest that favored the side with the most resources and the most intelligence. The gentleman commander, who had radioed the positions of survivors to the British Admiralty, was now witnessing an industrial catastrophe that would eventually sweep away the entire U-boat fleet and claim the lives of nearly 3,000 of the men who served in it. The Atlantic, which had once been the domain of German power, was becoming a tomb, and the wolf packs that had once hunted freely were becoming hunted themselves, their every movement tracked, anticipated, and engaged by an enemy that seemed to grow stronger and more coordinated with each passing week. May 1943 was the month when the Second World War turned beneath the waves, and it was a turning that none of the U-boat commanders would ever forget. By the middle of 1943, the men of the U-boat service knew something had changed in ways that no order from Berlin could reverse. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground where patient predators moved almost at will, had become a minefield of invisible threats. The convoys that German submarines had been trained to attack now moved with protection, so layered and so technical that a U-boat captain faced the grim mathematics of overwhelming disadvantage every time he approached the surface. The optimism of the happy time, that golden period when merchant ships fell to German torpedoes at a rate that seemed to guarantee starvation of the British Isles, belonged now to memory and to propaganda broadcasts that grew ever more disconnected from what actually happened beneath the grey Atlantic waves. The transformation came not as a single catastrophe, but as an accumulation of reversals that mounted through 1943 with the weight of a verdict written in blood and lost boats. The introduction of long-range aircraft from England, particularly the consolidated PBY Catalina and the Avro Lancaster, meant that German submarines could no longer rely on the depths of the ocean as sanctuary. These aircraft could hunt far enough into the mid-Atlantic to catch a U-boat in precisely those zones where it had once been safest to refuel and rearm. A submarine caught on the surface by an aircraft had seconds to dive, but sometimes there was no time at all. Sometimes the bombs fell first, and a U-boat that had survived the stress and danger of months at sea was erased in an instant by men it never saw. The code-breaking intelligence work carried out by the British and American signals intelligence services had reached a sophistication that the German High Command could not acknowledge and could therefore never adequately counter. The submarine tracking room in London knew the approximate positions and intentions of German wolf packs with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to U-boat commanders who were unaware their operational messages had been compromised. Convoys were routed around concentrations of submarines. Hunting groups of escort vessels were positioned with seemingly impossible precision. To a captain aboard a U-boat in 1943, it felt as though the British Navy had learned to read minds. The truth was almost equally demoralizing. The enemy knew where you were going before you knew it yourself. The technological gap widened with each month that passed. The Allies had developed new radar sets that could detect a U-boat on the surface in darkness, robbing submarines of the night advantage that had been sacred to their operational doctrine. Sonar, known to the Germans as ASDIC, became more refined and more difficult to evade. Escort vessels grew faster, deeper diving, and better armed. New patterns of depth charges were developed. New fuses created that made them explode closer and more devastatingly. A U-boat under attack faced not the relatively primitive anti-submarine warfare of 1940, but a coordinated, scientifically advanced system of detection and destruction that improved continuously. German submarines, meanwhile, were operating with technology fundamentally unchanged from what they had used when the war began. There was a lag between innovation and deployment that could not be overcome by courage or skill alone. The human cost of this technological mismatch was measured in the disappearance of crews. In May of 1943 alone, a month later, known as Black May by submariners across Europe, the U-boat arm suffered losses so catastrophic that they amounted to a breaking point. 41 submarines were sunk in that single month, more than the entire operational losses of the previous 12 months combined. Over 5,000 German submariners went down with their boats or into the ice-cold waters of the Atlantic, where rescue was rare and survival measured in minutes. The wolf-pack tactics that Dönitz had developed, which had once seemed to offer invincible coordination, became a vulnerability. Boats concentrated together meant that when one was attacked, others might be drawn into the same killing zone. The tactics that had promised victory created the conditions for mass catastrophe. The psychological impact of these losses on men still in service was profound and corrosive. A U-boat commander who sent a patrol report in 1943 could not be certain that the boat would be heard from again. The survival rate for U-boat crews by that point in the war was the lowest of any branch of the German military. A man who went to sea was statistically more likely to die than to return. The captains and crews were not stupid. They understood the mathematics. Every patrol was understood, at some level of consciousness, that few men dared speak aloud, as potentially the last. This knowledge seeped into the culture of the U-boat service, like cold water through a cracked hull, chilling morale and discipline, even among the most professional and dedicated men. Karl Dönitz, the supreme commander of the U-boat arm, faced an impossible strategic situation and responded with decisions that, while understandable from a military perspective, deepened the fatalism of his men. Knowing that he could no longer sustain the wolf-pack offensives that had characterized 1940 and 1941, Dönitz withdrew much of the U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic in the summer of 1943. He ordered operations to continue against convoys on the periphery and in distant waters, hoping to inflict significant damage with smaller forces. He authorized the development of new submarine types, equipped with snorkel apparatus, which would allow U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged, reducing their vulnerability. But these boats were not yet ready, and the ones that were not ready in sufficient numbers. The service was asked to continue fighting with technology that no longer competed, against an enemy whose advantages grew week by week. Men like Herbert Schultze, now serving in administrative and training capacities rather than on patrol, found themselves in an unexpected position of influence and moral weight. The most experienced commanders were kept from frontline duty, preserved as valuable strategic resources, and as teachers for the next generation. Schultze spent his time instructing new U-boat captains in the skills that had brought him success: navigation, approach tactics, judgment in combat, and the management of crews under extreme stress. But how could a man who had sunk merchant vessels in 1940, when victory seemed certain and losses were acceptable, teach young captains preparing for 1943 and 1944, when nearly every patrol was a race against extinction? The gap between what Schultze had accomplished under favorable conditions and what the new generation faced was almost obscene. He could teach them technique, but he could not teach them how to survive odds, that were designed to be unsurvivable. The veteran commanders attempted to sustain morale through example and through the assertion of professionalism in the face of despair. Standards of discipline were maintained. The esprit de corps of the U-boat service, the sense of belonging to an elite force bound together by shared danger, was deliberately cultivated and reinforced. Officers were instructed to maintain confidence, to project an appearance of belief in ultimate victory, even as that belief became harder and harder to maintain with any honesty. Men who showed signs of despair, or who questioned whether the patrols served any purpose, were quietly reassigned or kept from critical duties. The service was managed, essentially, through denial. The denial of what the statistics clearly demonstrated. The denial that the war at sea had already been lost. The relationship between the U-boat command structure and the men under them became increasingly complex in this period. Donitz remained personally devoted to his submariners and was respected by them in return. He would later claim that he had not fully understood the extent of the losses until after the war, though this claim has been questioned by historians who have examined his records and correspondence. What is clear is that the command made decisions that kept submarines at sea and crews on patrol, even when the probability of successful return had fallen below the threshold that rational military calculation would ordinarily accept. This was not cowardice or indifference on the part of the leadership. It was the logic of a service fighting for the survival of its entire institutional existence, even as that service became, in practical terms, a mechanism for the sacrifice of young men to a war that could no longer be won. The broader context made the situation even more stark. The German army was collapsing on the Eastern Front. Cities across the Reich were being bombed into rubble. Resources that might have been devoted to developing new submarine technology or building defensive systems were being redirected to lost causes on land. The U-boat service, once the sword arm of Germany's grand strategy, had become something else, a holding action, a way of continuing to hurt the enemy even as the war was fundamentally lost. Every U-boat that put to sea in 1944 was part of a gesture rather than a genuine attempt to alter the course of events. The service could no longer affect whether Germany won or lost the war, but it could still inflict losses on Allied shipping and keep the Atlantic from being entirely a safe supply route. There was a certain bitter dignity in this continued resistance, but it could not change the fact that young men were dying for increasingly diminished purposes. The final years of the U-boat service were characterized by a strange mixture of continued technical excellence and utter strategic futility. Patrols continued, attacks were still launched, some merchant vessels were still sunk. German submarines, even in the last year of the war, remained formidable opponents when they actually encountered enemy shipping. But the chance of a U-boat making an undetected approach to a well-defended convoy had become remote. The chance of a successful attack was measured in single-digit percentages. The chance of the U-boat returning to Germany had fallen to perhaps 1 in 3 across the entire service. These were not odds that military logic would choose to accept, yet they were accepted because the alternative was to surrender the Atlantic and to admit that the war was lost. The service continued, therefore, not because there was any realistic hope of victory, but because there was no acceptable alternative to continued fighting. The tonnage numbers, when Donitz read them aloud in his briefings, sounded like victories. Hundreds of thousands of tons sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, millions by the war's end. Each figure represented mathematical success, a step towards strangling Britain into submission. But beneath those statistics lay something the charts and casualty reports could never fully capture: the actual moment when a ship broke apart in the cold, when men discovered that the ocean had no mercy, and that survival itself became a question of seconds and terrible luck. The merchant vessels that crossed the Atlantic were not warships. They carried no guns that mattered, no armor that could stop a torpedo. They carried grain and oil and iron ore, the sinews of a nation trying to feed itself and forge weapons. The men who sailed these vessels were not soldiers. They were civilians mostly, or reservists called back to service. Sailors who had chosen peacetime merchant life and now found themselves in the crosshairs of a campaign that treated their deaths with all the emotional weight of a line item in a ledger. When a U-boat's periscope swung toward a freighter, the outcome was predetermined. The ship had no means of escape faster than the submarine, no way to outmaneuver an opponent that could strike from invisibility. All that remained was the moment of impact, and what came after. The waters of the North Atlantic in winter are among the most hostile on Earth. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and in such conditions, a man can lose consciousness in minutes. Exhaustion sets in within half an hour. The body shuts down with a kind of inexorable certainty. Those merchant sailors who found themselves in the water after their ships went down faced a mathematics of survival, utterly divorced from questions of bravery or will. Some ships, particularly the older vessels, pressed back into service for the duration, went down so quickly that there was no time to launch lifeboats. The ocean opened up to receive them, and the men aboard made their choice, not between fight and surrender, but between drowning quickly and drowning slowly. Hundreds went down with their ships. Hundreds more managed to reach lifeboats, only to face a different kind of death. Exposure, thirst, the slow dissolution of hope as they drifted in the vastness, watching the horizon for rescue that did not come. The British kept records. The Imperial War Museum holds accounts from survivors, men who floated for days, watching their companions slip away one by one. One merchant sailor drifted for 2 weeks, sustained by rainwater and the sight of other men dying around him. Another was pulled from the water after 4 days in a lifeboat with 8 other survivors. The boat was designed to hold 12, but the cold had taken its claim, and he was the only one still alive when the rescue vessel found them. These were not anomalies. Hundreds of merchant sailors experienced similar fates. Some lifeboats were never found. Others were spotted by passing ships, but were too damaged or too far off course to reach in time. The Atlantic, during those years of the U-boat war, became a graveyard as vast and impersonal as any battlefield, but with the added cruelty that these victims were civilians, going about the work of supply, not soldiers engaged in combat. The scale of merchant vessel losses staggers comprehension even now, more than 8 decades later. Over the course of the entire war, more than 2,000 merchant ships were sunk by German U-boats. The tonnage exceeded 30 million tons. Inside those figures are roughly 170,000 merchant sailors killed. That is the equivalent of a major city wiped out across 6 years of war. Some of these losses occurred before any convoy system existed, in 1939 and 1940, when ships crossed the Atlantic nearly at will, and submarines hunted them in relative isolation. Other losses came despite the convoys, despite the escort vessels, despite the accumulated tactics and technology that the Allies gradually brought to bear. The U-boat arm's greatest successes came in the early months of 1940 and 1941, the so-called happy time that Chapter 6 describes. But the happy time carried within it an unspoken appendix, the unhappy deaths of the men whose ships were sent to the bottom, who became casualties not of warfare in any symmetrical sense, but of a campaign of attrition waged against supply lines. It is necessary to remember that this campaign had a political purpose that extended beyond simple military advantage. The goal was starvation. Dönitz and his superiors understood that sinking merchant ships was a form of siege warfare, meant to break British will by breaking British supply. For every ton of shipping sunk, 1 ton less of food, fuel, and material could reach the British population and the British military. The civilian population of Britain experienced rationing, shortages, and the knowledge that convoy losses meant fewer resources for everyone. The war reached into homes and shops, into the calculations of housewives, deciding how to stretch an egg ration or a measure of sugar. And the men who died at sea were killed, in a sense, on behalf of all of this, on behalf of a strategy that made no distinction between a merchant sailor and a munitions worker, that treated the Atlantic crossing as a calculated risk that the Allies were willing to take in order to maintain supply. But the calculation was not even across the Atlantic. On the German side, the U-boat crews paid their own terrible price. A U-boat in operation was a vessel of extreme danger. The submarines were cramped, fetid, and loud, constantly creaking and groaning under the weight of the ocean. Men lived in bunks that reeked of diesel fuel and human waste. The food was often poor, and the psychological strain of remaining submerged for weeks at a time, knowing that at any moment a depth charge could come through the hull and kill everyone aboard, was a form of torture in its own right. By the end of the war, the majority of U-boat commanders and crews were young men. Many had no experience of anything but wartime service. They had grown up in the Third Reich, had been shaped by its ideology in ways that were inescapable, yet many of them were simply sailors, trying to survive a war they had not chosen. The losses among U-boat crews accelerated catastrophically as the Allies gained the upper hand. In 1940 and 1941, when U-boats dominated the Atlantic, the casualty rates among submariners were significant but manageable. Perhaps 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 submariners killed in action across a year of operations. But as the Allies introduced better escort vessels, longer-range aircraft, improved detection equipment, and tactical innovations, the tide reversed with brutal speed. By 1943, the year of Black May and its aftermath, the casualty rate among U-boat crews approached 50% or higher. Young men, many of them volunteers or conscripts who understood little of what they were enlisting for, found themselves packed into steel tubes that had become floating coffins. The submarines that left their bases did not always return. The crews that did not return did not always die quickly or clean deaths. Some U-boats were rammed by escort vessels. Some were bombed by aircraft and sank so quickly that there was no time for the crew to escape. Some were sunk, and their hulls were never recovered, leaving the families of the dead in a state of uncertainty about what had happened. The moral asymmetry in all of this deserves acknowledgement. German U-boat crews and merchant sailors were not equivalent groups. The U-boat arm was a tool of state policy, a weapon designed to carry out a blockade that was part of a war of conquest. The merchant sailors had no such choice. They were civilians, or they were soldiers conscripted into a service that was not primarily military in nature. Many had families, children who would grow up without fathers. Some were only boys, teenage apprentices on their first voyage, experiencing adulthood through the medium of a sinking ship and cold water. When a U-boat sank a merchant vessel, it was an act of war, but it was war waged by soldiers against people who were not soldiers, even if they served a military function. The Hamburg, the city of Glasgow, the Athenia, the Lusitania, names of ships and the names of the men who went down with them form a catalogue of loss that extends far beyond any reckoning of tactical advantage or strategic necessity. Herbert Schultze's decision to radio the British Admiralty with the positions of survivors becomes, in this context, something that shimmers with a strange kind of complexity. It was, on one hand, an extraordinary act of humanity in the midst of a campaign that was designed to be inhumane, a campaign that intentionally targeted the supply lines that kept civilians alive. The British radio operators, who heard his transmission asking for rescue vessels to be dispatched, received it across a divide of mortal enmity. The captains of the rescue ships that steamed toward the coordinates he provided were sailing into waters where German U-boats operated freely. Some of those rescue ships were themselves sunk by other submarines. Schultze's humanity thus cost lives as well as saving them. This is the terrible paradox of the Second World War, that even acts of decency could not escape the machinery of violence that had been set in motion. Yet what Schultze's actions illuminated was the very thing that the statistics and tonnage figures tried to obscure, that individual men crewed these submarines, and individual men commanded them, and that not all of them had surrendered their conscience to the demands of their service. When Schultze ordered a U-boat to surface, when he ensured that a lifeboat full of survivors had been seen and marked for rescue, he was making a choice that his system allowed him to make, even if it was a choice that went against the broader logic of the campaign. The fact that he could make that choice, that the choice was even available to him, speaks to something about the space that still existed within the machinery of industrial war for acts of individual agency. It also highlights, inevitably, all the other choices that other commanders made when they did not surface, when they did not radio coordinates, when they attacked rescue ships and lifeboats with the same indifference they reserved for the merchant vessels themselves. The Atlantic, by 1943 and 1944, had become a place where men on both sides understood that they were engaged in a war without the traditional courtesies that might once have applied. The U-boat crews were being hunted with increasing effectiveness, and they knew that their survival depended on sinking as many ships as possible before they themselves were sunk. The merchant sailors understood that crossing the Atlantic in wartime meant accepting a risk that was, for many, a death sentence. The escort crews understood that they were chasing an enemy that could disappear beneath the surface at a moment's notice, that could strike back with lethal force from depths where they could not follow. Everyone was trapped in a logic that had outrun human sentiment, a machinery that had developed its own momentum and its own terrible gravity. The war at sea was not a war between opposing sides in any meaningful sense. It was a war against supply lines, against the sinews that connected distant parts of the British and Soviet empires to their ability to wage war. And the cost was measured in the lives of merchant sailors, in U-boat crews, in the slow strangulation of resources and hope. When the war ended, the survivors on both sides had to reckon with what they had done and what had been done to them. The merchant sailors who had lost friends and shipmates to U-boat attacks carried that loss forward into peacetime. The U-boat crews who had survived internment and captivity had to reconcile themselves with the knowledge that they had participated in a campaign that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Some found solace in the belief that they had been following orders, that they had not chosen the war, but had simply served. Others, like Schultze, seemed to carry with them a kind of awareness that the distinction between following orders and taking responsibility was more ambiguous than it might first appear. The Atlantic, in its cold indifference, remembered all of them, remembered the men who sank and the men who sank them, remembered the ships that broke apart and the submarines that were hunted down and destroyed. The war at sea was, in the end, a story not of battles won or lost in any traditional military sense, but of human beings caught in a system of violence so vast and so impersonal that even the gentlemen among them could not entirely escape its reach. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was being crushed beneath the weight of a two-front war. In the east, the Soviet armies were pouring across Poland toward Germany itself. In the west, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were grinding toward the Rhine. The skies above German cities bloomed with fire and ash from relentless bombing campaigns, and beneath the Atlantic, the U-boat fleet that had once threatened to starve Britain into submission was itself dying, hunted, depleted, and operating under conditions that made each patrol feel less like a military operation and more like a ritual of sacrifice. For Herbert Schultze, who had stepped back from the command chair of U-48 years earlier and now occupied himself with training younger officers and administrative duties, the reality of impending defeat was impossible to ignore. The war he had fought in, the one that had earned him the Knight's Cross, and the gratitude of a desperate high command, had transformed into something unrecognizable, a prolonged death struggle with no hope of victory. The Kriegsmarine's response to its accelerating collapse was, in many ways, a study in the psychology of desperate men grasping at technological salvation. As conventional U-boats became increasingly vulnerable to Allied convoy escorts, radar-equipped aircraft, and the relentless application of superior industrial power, German naval engineers and the U-boat command staff under Karl Dönitz turned their attention to new designs and new technologies that might somehow restore the balance. The snorkel apparatus was one such innovation, a retractable mast that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged, drawing air from above the surface and exhausting through a separate shaft. On paper, it offered the promise of revolutionary advantage. Submarines could recharge their batteries beneath the waves, rather than exposing themselves on the surface at night, the traditional vulnerable moment in any U-boat's operational cycle. In theory, this would reduce the window of exposure to Allied detection. The snorkel-equipped boats of the Type 21, Type 23, and older vessels retrofitted with the apparatus represented the last major technological gamble of a dying regime. Schultze understood the technical merits of these innovations, as his role in training gave him exposure to the emerging boat designs. But he also understood something more fundamental. Technology alone could not restore a broken strategic situation. The operational reality beneath the waves told a far grimmer story than any technical briefing room ever could. By 1944, U-boat losses had reached catastrophic proportions. The average patrol was now statistically likely to be a one-way voyage. Many boats were crewed by men who knew, with near certainty, that they would not return from the Atlantic. Young commanders and junior officers had taken the place of the veteran aces, and while some possessed great skill and courage, they lacked the accumulated knowledge and intuition of men like Schultze, who had learned submarine warfare in its earlier, less lethal phase. The British and Americans had learned to hunt submarines with methodical precision. Escort vessels bristled with improved sonar equipment and depth charge patterns that were far more sophisticated than those of 1940. Aircraft, armed with improved radar and mounted on long-range maritime patrol platforms, could harry a U-boat relentlessly. The Germans, too, had developed better boat designs, but these advanced types came off the production lines in pitifully small numbers, and even when operational, they could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of facing an enemy with overwhelming air supremacy and the ability to read German radio communications with growing reliability. For a man who had tasted early success, who had watched the happy time unfold across 1940, with the U-boat arm triumphant in its element, the contrast must have been devastating. Schultze's precise duties in the closing years of the war remain less documented than his combat patrols. but the evidence suggests he occupied various posts within the training structure and administrative apparatus of the U-boat service. As the war ground on, preserving experienced commanders for teaching roles became a priority for Dönitz. The loss of a proven captain was not merely the death of one man, but the loss of accumulated tactical knowledge, and the symbolic catastrophe of announcing to subordinates that even the best and brightest did not come home. Schultze participated in the indoctrination and preparation of new commanding officers, passing on the techniques and psychological frameworks that had sustained him through years of Atlantic patrols. But there is a particular tragedy embedded in this role. He was, in effect, preparing men to die in a war already lost. He knew the operational statistics. He understood the calculus of probability that governed modern submarine warfare. Every officer he trained and every word of guidance he offered would be deployed into an ocean now controlled by enemies who had adapted to every tactic the U-boat arm could muster. The knowledge he imparted was still invaluable, but it was being transmitted not for victory, but for the prolongation of a losing struggle with whatever dignity and discipline could be maintained. The desperate measures undertaken by the High Command in these final years reflected the bankruptcy of Germany's strategic position. Dönitz, now promoted to Grand Admiral and eventually placed in command of the entire Kriegsmarine, clung to the belief that new submarines might yet turn the tide. Construction continued, even as the Reich contracted and resources grew scarcer. The Type 21, a truly modern design that in theory could make conventional U-boats obsolete, was earmarked for mass production, but mass production never materialized. Instead, a handful of these advanced boats entered service in the spring of 1945, when Germany itself was already teetering on the brink of collapse. Some theorists have argued that if these advanced submarines had arrived in the numbers originally envisioned, they might have caused genuine damage to Allied convoys. But this is the arithmetic of fantasy. In early 1945, Germany did not control the skies, did not control its own coasts, and could barely feed its population, let alone conduct the industrial mobilization required to build hundreds of advanced submarines. The regime's grasp on reality was increasingly tenuous. Dönitz himself was capable, even in these final months, of composing operational orders as though the U-boat arm might yet achieve something decisive. His men obeyed. They always did. By the time the new year of 1945 arrived, the military situation had become so dire that discussion of surrender was no longer a matter of speculation, but of imminent fact. The Soviets were in East Prussia and Poland, advancing inexorably toward Berlin. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. German cities were being destroyed in firestorms, their populations fleeing or dead beneath collapsed rubble. The regime itself was fragmenting. Some officers were beginning to contemplate escape or negotiation. Others, bound by oath and habit and the sheer psychological weight of total war, continued to fight with a kind of mechanical desperation. The U-boat service, despite everything, continued to send boats to sea. Schultze would have observed this phenomenon from whatever shore posting he occupied. The awareness that young men were being sent to hunt prey that no longer existed, to defend convoys that might never reach their destinations, to conduct operations whose only certain outcome was their own deaths. The gap between the operational orders flowing from the High Command and the actual strategic situation facing Germany had become not merely a distance, but a chasm. Orders to continue the fight were issued, even as the war was being lost in real time, in the West, in the East, in the cities, and beneath the Atlantic. The final German efforts in submarine warfare took forms increasingly divorced from reality. Some boats were fitted with experimental anti-aircraft weapons, or with acoustic homing torpedoes, designed to track the sound of Allied escort vessels. Others attempted to operate in the coastal waters, where long-range aircraft had less reach, or were sent to distant theaters, the Norwegian coast, the Bay of Biscay, even the waters off Norway, and in the Arctic, in desperate attempts to find hunting grounds the enemy had not yet saturated with their technological superiority. None of these measures could reverse the fundamental equation. The Kriegsmarine was not merely losing. It was being methodically dismantled by an enemy that possessed virtually every advantage: air superiority, superior numbers, better technology, the ability to read German communications, access to logistics networks that were virtually inexhaustible. These advantages compounded one another in a vicious spiral of German diminishment. For officers like Schultze, who had been present at the creation of the new U-boat arm in the 1930s, who had watched it grow into a powerful instrument, who had participated in its greatest victories, the knowledge of what was happening must have carried the weight of witnessing something die that they had helped to build. In April of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and the regime's final days approached, Schultze was forced to confront the knowledge that the war was ending in total defeat. The orders came down from higher command. All remaining U-boats were to be preserved. Some were to be scuttled. Others were to surrender to Allied forces. The carefully constructed service that Dönitz had built, the men who crewed the boats themselves, all of it was being systematically dismantled or surrendered to the enemy. For a man who had devoted his adult life to the Kriegsmarine, who had been trained to believe in duty and obedience and the primacy of the service, the moment of surrender must have represented something close to an existential rupture. The boats that had been his world, the officers and men he had trained, the mission he had served, all of it was ending not in glorious last stand, but in the bureaucratic procedures of defeat. Schultze received orders to ensure that various U-boats under his administrative purview were either scuttled or readied for surrender to the British. He complied with these orders, as he had complied with every order throughout his naval career. There is no recorded evidence of protest or hesitation, but for a man of his background and character, the knowledge of total defeat and the end of the service to which he had dedicated his life would have been a form of death in itself. The scuttling of the U-boat fleet in the final weeks of the war was a grim procedure, boats being sent to the bottom in organized fashion, either by their own crews or by Allied naval personnel who took custody of surrendered vessels. Operation Deadlight, the code name for the systematic destruction of German submarines after the surrender, represented a kind of final punctuation mark on the entire campaign. Hundreds of U-boats that had been constructed, manned, and deployed across 5 years of warfare were reduced to wreckage and sinking steel in the waters where they had operated. Some were scuttled by their own crews in harbors and rivers as the Allies advanced. Others were towed out to sea by British destroyers and sunk by explosives placed in their hulls. The psychological impact of witnessing this process cannot be easily conveyed. These submarines were not merely machines. They were the embodiment of German naval power, the vessels in which thousands of young men had lived and died. Their destruction was necessary, perhaps from the Allied perspective, a means of preventing the possibility of any resumed submarine operations. But from the German side, the slow, methodical sinking of the fleet was a visual representation of total defeat, a ceremony of the end of German sea power that had taken centuries to build and that had been destroyed in a single decade of war. Schultze's personal experience of these final weeks remains incomplete in the historical record, but like other U-boat officers and men, he would have moved through the landscape of a collapsing nation, watching the structures of military authority dissolve around him. The surrender order came on the 7th of May, 1945. Germany ceased to exist as a unified state overnight. The Kriegsmarine, which had been an instrument of the German state, simply stopped existing. Officers like Schultze, who had believed themselves bound to duty, suddenly found that duty itself had been abrogated by their nation's unconditional surrender. There was no negotiated peace, no terms to discuss, no continuation. Only the fact of defeat made total and absolute. The U-boats at sea, and there were still boats operating in the final days, received orders to surface and surrender to the nearest Allied vessel or proceed to designated ports. Some boats were scuttled by their crews rather than surrender. Others made their way to British and American ports. A very few attempted to make for Argentina or other neutral nations in a futile gesture of continuing the war. But the end result was never in doubt. The U-boat arm, which had existed for only about 7 years, but which had transformed submarine warfare and inflicted staggering losses on Allied merchant shipping, ceased to exist as an organized military force. For Schultze personally, the immediate aftermath of surrender meant internment and interrogation by British naval intelligence. Like other German naval officers, he would have been processed through the machinery of military justice and intelligence gathering. The British would have been interested in his account of U-boat operations, tactics, and the men he had known and trained. But unlike some U-boat commanders who faced more serious accusations, Schultze's reputation, built on the humanitarian acts he had performed during his years as a combat commander, appears to have preceded him into captivity. He was not a man wanted for atrocities or war crimes. He was, if anything, the opposite. The officer famous for having radioed the positions of survivors, for having treated his enemies with a respect that was as rare in submarine warfare as it was unexpected. The interrogators would have noted this, even as they extracted whatever operational details he possessed. Schultze entered captivity not as a war criminal, but as a defeated enemy, a man whose hands were clean, even if he had participated in the sinking of many ships and the deaths of many sailors. The distinction was not insignificant, and it would protect him in the years to come. The collapse of German naval resistance at sea in 1945 was not a process of dramatic last stands or heroic final engagements. It was instead a slow dissolution, a service fragmenting and disappearing into the machinery of surrender and defeat. There were no final battles comparable to the great naval engagements of earlier wars. There was no Trafalgar, no moment of fleet versus fleet combat that would crystallize the nation's defeat into a singular event. Instead, there was the grinding reality of an enemy so dominant that organized resistance had become impossible. The U-boats were hunted to extinction, not through direct engagement, but through superior technology, superior numbers, superior resources, and the ability to control the ocean itself. For Herbert Schultze, watching this process from whatever position he occupied in the dying regime, the knowledge must have been crystalline and terrible. The service that had been born when he was a young officer, that had grown to power and dominance, that had earned him fame and recognition and the Knight's Cross, was ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, systematic destruction of a weapon that had run out of ammunition, fuel, and time. The Atlantic, which had been the stage for his greatest triumphs and the forum for his acts of humanity. The message arrived at U-boat bases across occupied France and Germany in the first week of May 1945. Not through official channels at first, but in fragments. A radio broadcast. A rumor passed between exhausted men. The Führer was dead. The Reich was negotiating. By the 7th of May, the wireless operators had confirmation. Germany would surrender unconditionally. The war that had consumed 6 years of Europe's life, that had sent millions to their deaths across 3 continents, was finished. For Herbert Schultze, the news did not arrive as liberation or vindication. It came as a kind of anesthesia, a numbness that would persist long after the fighting stopped. He was ashore by this point, far from the bridge of U-48, occupying a training role in a collapsing military structure. The submarine arm that had promised him glory and had delivered something far more complicated: fame, responsibility, and the weight of decisions that could never be unmade, had one final task ahead of him: survival. Not physical survival, though that too hung in balance. Spiritual survival, the survival of the man he believed himself to be. The surrender itself was chaotic, almost grotesque in its anticlimax. German officers who had commanded fleets and legions now scrambled for transportation, for papers, for anything that might provide shelter in the wreckage of their nation. The Kriegsmarine, once the pride of German engineering and ambition, began to disintegrate. U-boats at sea received orders to surface and make for the nearest Allied port. Some commanders obeyed immediately. Others, trapped in a cycle of denial or defiance, attempted to break through to Argentina or to disappear into remote harbors where they might somehow avoid capture. The psychological impact on the U-boat arm cannot be overstated. These men had been told for years that they were the vanguard of German power, that their tonnage sunk and their feats of endurance represented the Reich's ultimate technological and spiritual superiority. They had believed it, many of them, even as the evidence mounted to the contrary. And now that belief system was being dismantled in real time. No redemption would come. No final victory lay hidden in the coming months. The war was over, and they had lost. For those U-boats that surrendered to Allied forces, the immediate experience was one of shock mixed with strange relief. The first submarines to surface in the Atlantic and North Sea faced the curious sight of British and American naval vessels approaching them. Not to attack, not to capture, but to take possession. The moment of surrender was often surreal. Commanders who had spent years evading destroyers and corvettes now watched as enemy sailors came aboard their boats with clipboards and manifest sheets. Some crews wept. Others seemed almost peaceful, as though a tension that had been wound tight inside them for years had finally been released. The boats themselves were often in terrible condition. The newer Type 21 and Type 23 submarines were sleek and fast, but many of the older types bore the scars of years of Atlantic service. Rust, dents, the accumulated wear of patrols that had pushed both vessel and crew to the edge of human endurance. As the Allied sailors surveyed these vessels, they were seeing not just enemy submarines, but the living history of a war that had cost them friends, shipmates, and the security of their own nations. Schultze's path to internment remains less documented than the broader experience of other U-boat commanders, but the outlines are clear enough. As the war ended, he was in Germany proper, part of the administrative and training apparatus, rather than commanding at sea. The chaos of the German collapse was all around him. American forces advancing from the west, Soviet armies rolling in from the east, the entire governmental and military structure dissolving into fragments. Officers were fleeing, burning documents, attempting to establish themselves in areas that might fall to Western rather than Soviet occupation, a calculation that would determine the shape of their post-war lives. When American forces reached his location, Schultze was processed like tens of thousands of other German military personnel. Interrogation came first. Allied naval intelligence was intensely interested in U-boat commanders, especially the aces, the men who had sunk significant tonnage. They wanted to understand the U-boat arm from the inside, how it had been organized, how tactics had evolved, what technological innovations had been attempted, and critically, they wanted to assess the culpability of individual officers for potential war crimes. Schultze's interrogation would have touched on all of these subjects, but with a particular focus on his conduct during his active patrols. The interrogators who faced him would have known his reputation: the Knight's Cross winner, the gentleman of the Atlantic, the commander who had radioed positions of survivors to the British Admiralty, asking for rescue vessels. To Allied naval officers, this was extraordinary, almost incomprehensible within the context of submarine warfare. It suggested a man who operated according to a personal code, rather than pure military doctrine. It suggested conscience. And in the immediate post-war period, conscience was something that distinguished certain Germans from the broader machinery of the Nazi state. Schultze's interrogation files, insofar as they can be accessed, do not suggest he was treated as a war criminal. He was a prisoner of war, subject to internment under the Geneva Convention, but not singled out for prosecution. His gentlemanly conduct had created a protective buffer around him, even as the victorious powers were beginning to investigate questions of German responsibility for the war's conduct. Other U-boat commanders would face far more serious scrutiny. Men accused of torpedoing lifeboats, of machine-gunning survivors, of conduct that crossed even the murky ethical lines of submarine warfare. Schultze was not among them. The internment camps themselves were sprawling, almost tent cities set up across occupied Germany, and in some cases on Allied territory. Tens of thousands of German officers and men were held in these facilities, awaiting processing, trial, or eventual release. The conditions were generally better than what had been inflicted on prisoners in German camps, but they were still fundamentally demoralizing. Men who had held rank, who had commanded others, who had been celebrated as heroes, now stood in lines for meals, slept in crowded tents, and waited for news of their fates. Schultze would have experienced this profound inversion of status, this stripping away of identity and authority that was the internment process. The discipline he had maintained aboard U-48, the command presence that had held his crew together through years of Atlantic patrols, meant nothing here. He was simply one more German officer among thousands, distinguished only by those who recognized his name or reputation. But while Schultze and other U-boat commanders endured internment, a more sinister fate was befalling the submarines themselves. Operation Deadlight was the code name for the scuttling of German U-boats that had surrendered to the Allies. The decision to sink these vessels rather than preserve them, studying them, or incorporating them into Allied navies, was partly strategic but also partly symbolic. These boats had killed tens of thousands of sailors and merchant seamen. They were instruments of a war that had devastated Europe, and there was no real desire in the Allied navies to preserve them as war trophies or technical specimens. Some boats were retained for testing and interrogation, their hulls providing information about German submarine design and innovation. But most were simply towed out into the Atlantic, their compartments flooded, their hulls blown open or scuttled. The moment of sinking was often photographed. In image after image, U-boats slipped beneath the North Atlantic waves, the same waters that had hosted so many of their patrols, so many of their kills. One submarine after another disappeared beneath the surface, carrying with it the accumulated memories of its crew, the history of its sorties, the testimonies of its construction and command. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 200 U-boats were destroyed in Operation Deadlight. The scale of the destruction was, in its way, a reflection of the scale of the U-boat campaign itself. Dönitz had commanded a fleet that had grown to more than 400 submarines at its peak. By the war's end, most were gone, sunk in combat, damaged beyond repair, or lost to the catastrophic casualty rates that had mounted through 1943 and 44. The surviving boats, the ones that had made it to May 1945, intact, now faced the final indignity of being sent to the bottom by the victors. It was not war. It was not even justice in any conventional sense. It was simply the erasure of the physical evidence of an entire branch of military power. The men who had served in these boats, who had risked their lives in the cold and darkness of the Atlantic, could only watch helplessly as the instruments of their service were systematically destroyed. For commanders like Schultze, the sinking of the U-boats represented something more than loss of equipment. It was the end of a world, the dissolution of an entire military culture. The psychological impact on Schultze of seeing the U-boat arm destroyed is difficult to quantify, but must have been profound. He had spent the better part of a decade training for submarine service, serving with distinction aboard one of the war's most successful U-boats, and then training the next generation of commanders. The U-boat arm had been his identity, his purpose, his community. It had given him status and responsibility at a young age. It had placed him in a position where he could make decisions about mercy and cruelty, and where he had, in his own estimation, chosen mercy. That entire structure was now gone. The boats were at the bottom of the Atlantic. The men who had crewed them were scattered, dead, imprisoned, or struggling to reconstruct their lives in a defeated and divided Germany. The ideology that had motivated the entire enterprise, the Nazi state that had constructed and deployed the U-boat arm, had been utterly discredited. Schultze would emerge from internment into a country that was occupied, divided, and psychologically scarred. West Germany, which is where he would eventually be released, was under British and American military government. There was no German state in the conventional sense. There was no Kriegsmarine. There was no continuing U-boat service. There was only the rubble of cities and the memory of a conflict that had consumed 60 million lives. The process of release from internment was gradual and inconsistent. Officers of junior rank, especially those with no direct command responsibility and no evidence of war crimes, began to be released in 1946 and 1947. Schultze, as a former captain with command experience, would likely have been retained longer than some junior officers, but shorter than commanders who faced more serious accusations. By 1948, most U-boat officers who were not facing trial or serious investigation had been released back into civilian life. It was a strange transition. These men had to find employment, housing, and a place in post-war society, a society that had fundamentally rejected the ideology that had shaped their military service. Many of